Welcome, fellow guardian of ancient legends, to the deepest chronicles of the King of Monsters, where atomic fire burns eternal in the collective memory of humanity, and the echoes of prehistoric roars still thunder across the landscapes of imagination. Tonight we shall journey through 70 years of cinematic mythology, from the ashes of Hiroshima to the digital realms of modern filmmaking, tracing the evolution of a creature born from humanity's darkest hour, yet destined to become its most enduring symbol of both destruction and protection. Close your eyes now, and let the atomic heartbeat of Godzilla carry you into peaceful slumber as we walk together through the halls of monster movie history, where science fiction and cultural trauma dance their eternal waltz. In the beginning of endings, when the world learned that atoms themselves could be transformed into weapons capable of erasing entire cities from existence, there came a moment on the morning of August 6th, 1945, when the course of human history was altered by a single flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns. At 8:15 in the morning, the Enola Gay released its terrible cargo over the city of Hiroshima, and in the space of a heartbeat, the atomic age was born in fire and shadow that would scar the Earth and human consciousness for generations yet to come. The explosion that followed was beyond the comprehension of mortals who had never witnessed such concentrated destruction. As temperatures reaching millions of degrees vaporized everything within the immediate blast radius, while winds exceeding hurricane force swept outward in concentric circles of devastation. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash and twisted metal in seconds, while human beings caught within the expanding sphere of annihilation were transformed into shadows burned permanently into concrete and stone, their final moments preserved as dark silhouettes that would haunt the survivors and their descendants for decades. The mushroom cloud that rose above Hiroshima on that August morning stretched 9 miles into the atmosphere, its distinctive shape becoming an icon of humanity's newfound power to destroy itself completely, while radioactive fallout drifted across the landscape like poisonous snow that would continue claiming lives long after the immediate fires had been extinguished. Approximately 80,000 souls perished in the initial blast, yet this number represented only the beginning of the tragedy, as radiation sickness would claim thousands more in the weeks and months that followed. 3 days later, as Japan struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had befallen Hiroshima, a second atomic weapon was detonated over the port city of Nagasaki, claiming an additional 40,000 lives and demonstrating to the world that the Hiroshima bomb had not been a singular achievement but the first deployment of an entirely new category of warfare. The surrender that followed on August 15th ended World War II but began an era of nuclear anxiety that would define the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. Yet the immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender brought with it a censorship campaign orchestrated by the Allied occupation forces that sought to control not merely the physical reconstruction of the devastated nation but the very narrative of what had occurred during those terrible August days. Under the authority of General Douglas MacArthur and the Supreme Command for the Allied powers, Japanese media was forbidden from publishing detailed accounts of the atomic bombings or their effects upon the civilian population, while American authorities worked systematically to suppress photographic evidence and eyewitness testimony that might reveal the true scope of the devastation that nuclear weapons had wrought. The censorship that followed was as comprehensive as it was deliberate, extending beyond mere military concerns to encompass what Japanese film critic Tadao Sato would later describe as the complete prohibition of factual reporting about the atomic experience. Only sentimentalized treatments of the bombings were permitted, productions that focused upon human resilience and recovery, rather than the systematic documentation of radiation effects, genetic damage, and the ongoing medical crisis that continued to claim lives years after the initial explosions. This official silence created a cultural vacuum within Japanese society, as an entire generation grew to adulthood without access to comprehensive information about the most significant events in their nation's modern history. The Hibakusha, or atomic bomb survivors, found themselves unable to share their experiences publicly, while medical professionals were forbidden from publishing research about radiation sickness and its long-term effects upon human physiology and genetic inheritance. It was not until 1952, with the formal end of the American occupation and the restoration of Japanese sovereignty, that filmmakers and journalists were finally permitted to approach the atomic bombings as subjects suitable for serious artistic and documentary treatment. The first film to address the tragedy directly was Kaneto Shindo's Children of Hiroshima. Released only months after the occupation's conclusion and featuring unflinching portrayals of radiation's effects upon the survivors who had lived through the initial blast only to face years of illness, disfigurement, and social ostracism. This breakthrough was followed by additional productions that sought to document and memorialize the atomic experience, including the Teachers Union-funded film simply titled Hiroshima, which provided even more graphic and detailed depictions of the bombing's aftermath. These early atomic films represented more than entertainment or even historical documentation. They were acts of cultural reclamation that allowed Japanese society to begin processing trauma that had been artificially suppressed for 7 years. Against this backdrop of emerging atomic consciousness, the events of March 1st, 1954, would provide the catalyst that would transform abstract nuclear anxiety into the concrete mythology of Godzilla. On that morning, the Japanese tuna fishing vessel Daigo Fukuru Maru, known in English as the Lucky Dragon No. 5, was operating in what its crew believed to be international waters near the Marshall Islands, pursuing their livelihood in the vast Pacific fisheries that had sustained Japanese communities for centuries. Unknown to Captain Hisakichi Tsutsui and his 23 crew members, the United States was conducting Operation Castle, a series of hydrogen bomb tests at Bikini Atoll that represented a quantum leap beyond even the weapons that had devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The device detonated that morning, codenamed Castle Bravo, was designed to yield 6 megatons of explosive force, but actually produced 15 megatons, making it more than 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima. The Lucky Dragon was positioned approximately 80 miles east of the test site when Castle Bravo was detonated, a distance that American military planners had calculated would provide adequate safety margins for any vessels that might inadvertently enter the area. Yet the hydrogen bomb's yield exceeded all predictions, and the radioactive fallout that rained down upon the Pacific Ocean covered a far larger area than anyone had anticipated, transforming the Lucky Dragon and its crew into unwitting participants in humanity's most powerful nuclear test. The white ash that began falling upon the vessel several hours after the test appeared harmless to crew members who had no frame of reference for understanding what they were experiencing. Yet this seemingly innocent powder was laden with radioactive isotopes that immediately began inflicting cellular damage upon everyone exposed to it. The fishermen, following natural instincts to investigate this unusual phenomenon, collected samples of the ash and even tasted it, unknowingly increasing their radiation exposure with every passing moment. By the time the Lucky Dragon returned to its home port of Yaizu 2 weeks later, all 23 crew members were suffering from acute radiation sickness, their symptoms including nausea, hair loss, skin burns, and internal bleeding that medical professionals initially struggled to diagnose and treat. The ash that they had brought back with them was found to be highly radioactive, while the tuna they had caught during their voyage was so contaminated that it had to be destroyed to prevent radioactive material from entering the Japanese food supply. The most tragic victim of this nuclear accident was Aikichi Kuboyama, the Lucky Dragon's radio operator, whose radiation exposure proved fatal despite months of treatment in Tokyo hospitals. His death on September 23, 1954, made him the first confirmed fatality of the hydrogen bomb era and transformed what had been a diplomatic incident into a human tragedy that resonated throughout Japanese society. The Lucky Dragon incident ignited anti-nuclear sentiment that had been building within Japanese communities since the end of the occupation's censorship restrictions. As citizens who had previously been forbidden from discussing atomic weapons found themselves confronting new evidence of America's willingness to conduct nuclear tests without adequate regard for the safety of innocent civilians. The contaminated tuna became a powerful symbol of how atomic testing could affect the daily lives of ordinary Japanese families, while Kuboyama's slow death from radiation sickness provided a human face for the abstract dangers of nuclear warfare. Producer Tomoyuki Tanaka of Toho Studios found himself personally connected to these events through circumstances that would prove crucial to the development of Japanese cinema's most enduring icon. Tanaka had been tasked with traveling to Jakarta to negotiate the production of a Japanese-Indonesian co-production titled In the Shadow of Glory, which was intended to explore the complex legacy of Japan's wartime occupation of Indonesia and its aftermath in the post-colonial period. The project foundered when Indonesian authorities, citing anti-Japanese sentiment that remained strong nearly a decade after the end of World War II, refused to grant visas to Japanese filmmakers, leaving Tanaka's diplomatic mission incomplete and forcing him to return to Tokyo empty-handed. It was during his flight home across the Pacific Ocean that Tanaka found himself gazing down at the waters below and contemplating the Lucky Dragon incident, which had dominated Japanese headlines throughout his unsuccessful negotiations. The vast expanse of the Pacific that stretched beneath his aircraft had been transformed by nuclear testing from a source of sustenance and livelihood into a potential zone of contamination and death, while the creatures that lived within its depths faced threats that had never existed during the millions of years of their evolutionary development. The image that began forming in Tanaka's mind during that flight would combine the atomic anxieties that had been building within Japanese society with the cinematic possibilities offered by advances in special effects technology that could bring impossible creatures to life upon the silver screen. The concept that would eventually become Godzilla emerged from this intersection of personal experience with national trauma, as Tanaka recognized that the fears and uncertainties surrounding nuclear weapons could be given concrete form through the creation of a monster that embodied both the destructive power of atomic energy and the unpredictable consequences of humanity's willingness to tamper with forces beyond their understanding or control. The creative process that would transform this initial inspiration into a fully realized film brought together some of the most talented individuals working in Japanese cinema during the 1950s, each contributing expertise that would prove essential to the project's success. Director Ishiro Honda brought to the collaboration a deep understanding of wartime trauma and social responsibility that would inform every aspect of the film's thematic development, while special effects master Eiji Tsuburaya possessed the technical knowledge necessary to create convincing depictions of massive destruction and prehistoric monsters. The design evolution of the creature that would become Godzilla reflected both practical filmmaking considerations and deeper symbolic intentions that would resonate with audiences who had lived through the atomic bombings and their pressed aftermath. Early concepts envisioned the monster as a combination of gorilla and whale characteristics, with the Japanese names for these animals providing the linguistic foundation for the name Gojira, which would eventually be anglicized as Godzilla for international audiences. Yet, as the creature's design developed through multiple iterations, its appearance increasingly emphasized dinosaurian features that would make it seem both ancient and alien, a survivor from prehistoric eras that had been awakened and transformed by humanity's atomic experiments. The monster's head was deliberately sculpted to resemble a mushroom cloud when viewed from certain angles, while the texture of its skin was designed to evoke the burned flesh of atomic bomb survivors, creating visual metaphors that connected the creature directly to the nuclear experiences that had shaped contemporary Japanese consciousness. The atomic breath that would become Godzilla's signature weapon was conceived as a direct manifestation of the nuclear forces that had created the monster, allowing it to inflict upon human civilization the same kind of instantaneous destruction that atomic bombs had visited upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The radioactivity that the monster carried with it contaminated everything it touched, from the fish that died in Tokyo Bay to the vegetation that withered in its wake, creating ecological disasters that paralleled the contamination issues that Japanese communities continued to face years after the atomic bombings. Most importantly, the creative team behind Gojira understood that their monster should not be portrayed as a conventional antagonist whose evil motivations could be understood and potentially reasoned with, but rather as a force of nature whose actions were driven by instincts and impulses that lay beyond human comprehension or moral categories. Godzilla was neither good nor evil, but simply was, a manifestation of consequences that humanity had brought upon itself through its willingness to split atoms for destructive purposes. This philosophical approach to the monster's characterization would prove crucial to the film's impact upon audiences who recognized in Godzilla's rampage through Tokyo echoes of their own experiences during the final years of World War II, when American bombing campaigns had reduced Japanese cities to smoking ruins through conventional incendiary weapons that prefigured the atomic destruction that would follow. The scenes of panicked civilians fleeing through burning streets carried particular resonance for viewers who had lived through similar experiences, while the monster's casual destruction of urban infrastructure reminded them of how quickly the foundations of modern civilization could be swept away by forces beyond individual control. In the deep places of cultural memory, where personal trauma intersects with collective mythology and individual suffering becomes the raw material for artistic expression, the stage was being set for the birth of a legend that would outlive its creators and continue speaking to new generations about the dangers and possibilities inherent in humanity's relationship with the atomic forces they had learned to unleash but could never fully control. In the year 1954, when the ashes of atomic fire still smoldered in the collective memory of Japan and the radioactive contamination from the Lucky Dragon incident had awakened a nation to the ongoing dangers of nuclear testing, the creative forces that would bring forth the most enduring monster in cinema history gathered in the studios of Toho Productions, like alchemists, preparing to transmute cultural trauma into cinematic gold. The vision that producer Tomoyuki Tanaka had conceived during his flight over the Pacific would require the combined talents of artists and technicians whose individual expertise would prove essential to creating a creature that could embody the fears and anxieties of an entire generation. Director Ishiro Honda, whose wartime service had given him intimate knowledge of destruction and its aftermath, approached the project with the understanding that entertainment could serve higher purposes than mere escapism when it dared to confront the realities that audiences carried within their hearts and memories. Honda had witnessed firsthand the devastation that modern warfare could inflict upon civilian populations, and his commitment to treating Godzilla as more than a simple monster movie reflected his belief that cinema possessed the power to help societies process trauma through the safe distance that fictional narratives could provide. The director's vision for the film was grounded in respect for the experiences of those who had survived the atomic bombings. Yet it also recognized that literal depictions of nuclear warfare would be too painful for audiences who had lived through such events directly. By translating atomic destruction into the actions of a prehistoric monster, Honda created a metaphorical framework that allowed viewers to confront their fears about nuclear weapons while maintaining enough emotional distance to process these anxieties without being overwhelmed by memories of personal loss and suffering. Special effects director Eiji Tsuburaya brought to the collaboration technical innovations that would establish new standards for monster movie production throughout the world. Yet his contributions extended far beyond mere craftsmanship to encompass artistic choices that enhanced the film's thematic resonance. Tsuburaya understood that the monster's believability would depend not only upon the sophistication of his suit construction and miniature work, but also upon the care with which destruction sequences were filmed and edited to create maximum emotional impact. The painstaking process of constructing miniature versions of Tokyo's most recognizable landmarks required months of detailed work by craftsmen who understood that their creations would exist only to be destroyed, yet who approached this seemingly futile task with the dedication of artists creating permanent masterpieces. Every building, street, and vehicle was built to precise scale and populated with tiny details that would be visible for only moments before being crushed beneath the monster's feet or incinerated by its atomic breath. The Godzilla suit that would house performer Haruo Nakajima during the film's production represented a triumph of practical effects artistry that required innovations in materials and construction techniques to achieve the desired combination of mobility and visual authenticity. Weighing more than 200 pounds when fully assembled, the costume demanded extraordinary physical endurance from its wearer, who spent hours beneath hot studio lights while performing the deliberate, lumbering movements that would define Godzilla's distinctive gait for generations of filmgoers. Nakajima's performance within the confines of the cumbersome suit was guided by Honda's direction toward movements that suggested both immense physical power and an alien intelligence that operated according to principles beyond human understanding. The actor's background in martial arts and dance provided him with the body awareness necessary to convey the monster's massive scale through carefully controlled gestures that suggested weight and momentum far beyond what any human performer could naturally possess. The challenge of creating convincing interactions between the suited performer and the miniature sets required precise choreography that coordinated Nakajima's movements with camera angles and lighting effects designed to maintain the illusion of gigantic scale throughout sequences that might involve dozens of individual shots filmed over several days. The integration of live-action footage featuring human actors with the special effects sequences demanded technical precision that pushed the boundaries of what had been achieved in previous monster movies. Composer Akira Ifukube's musical score provided the sonic landscape that would transform Tsuburaya's visual effects into emotionally resonant cinema, with themes that ranged from the monster's ominous footsteps to the tragic beauty of destruction viewed from a distance. Ifukube's background in classical composition enabled him to create musical motifs that enhanced the film's metaphorical dimensions while providing the rhythmic foundation that would synchronize with Godzilla's movements and the pacing of its attacks upon human civilization. The composer's decision to emphasize brass and percussion instruments in creating Godzilla's musical identity reflected both practical considerations about which orchestral sections could most effectively convey massive scale and pain, deeper artistic choices about the kinds of emotions the monster should evoke in audiences. The famous Godzilla march that would accompany the creature's appearances throughout the film was designed to suggest inexorable forward momentum combined with a tragic majesty that prevented viewers from dismissing the monster as merely a destructive force without deeper significance. The roar that would become Godzilla's most recognizable vocal signature was created through innovative sound design techniques that combined natural animal vocalizations with electronic manipulation to produce an audio effect that had never been heard before in any medium. The distinctive sound was achieved by running a resin-covered leather glove along the loosened strings of a bass violin, then processing the resulting audio through various filters and playback systems to create a voice that seemed to emerge from the depths of prehistoric time. This carefully crafted roar was intended to convey not mere animal aggression, but a form of communication that transcended species boundaries, expressing pain, rage, and loneliness in frequencies that human ears could hear but human voices could never produce. The sound became so closely associated with the character that later films would use variations of Ifukube's original creation as a form of musical shorthand that could instantly identify Godzilla's presence, even when the monster remained off-screen. The film's opening sequences established the mysterious nature of the threat through carefully controlled revelation of information that paralleled the way atomic dangers had been gradually revealed to Japanese society through government censorship and media manipulation. Ships disappeared in the Pacific under mysterious circumstances that echoed the fate of the Lucky Dragon, while survivors' accounts of blinding lights and radioactive contamination provided clear connections to contemporary nuclear anxieties without explicitly naming atomic weapons as the source of the disaster. Dr. Yamane's scientific investigation of the monster's origins provided exposition that transformed Godzilla from supernatural phenomenon into a creature whose existence could be understood through rational inquiry, yet whose capabilities exceeded anything that modern science could hope to control or contain. The paleontologists' discovery that the monster represented a species that had survived since the Jurassic period, only to be awakened and mutated by hydrogen bomb testing, created a direct causal link between human atomic experiments and the catastrophic consequences that followed. The scenes depicting Godzilla's first attack upon Tokyo were choreographed and filmed to maximize their emotional impact upon audiences who retained vivid memories of wartime air raids and urban destruction, with particular attention paid to the perspectives of civilian victims who found themselves helpless in the face of forces beyond their ability to resist or escape. The monster's rampage through residential neighborhoods was designed to evoke the arbitrary nature of wartime casualties, as families were separated and individuals faced instant annihilation without regard for their personal virtue or social standing. The radioactive aftermath of Godzilla's attack created contamination zones that rendered large areas of Tokyo uninhabitable, paralleling the ongoing effects of atomic bombing that continued to claim lives years after the initial explosions through cancer, genetic damage, and environmental poisoning. Hospital scenes featuring radiation sickness victims provided stark visual reminders of the medical consequences that atomic weapons inflicted upon civilian populations, while scientists' warnings about long-term contamination echoed contemporary concerns about nuclear fallout and its effects upon future generations. The oxygen destroyer that Dr. Serizawa had developed in secret represented both humanity's ultimate weapon against the atomic monster and a moral dilemma that encapsulated the ethical complexities surrounding weapons of mass destruction. Serizawa's reluctance to reveal his invention reflected the internal conflicts faced by scientists who had contributed to atomic weapons development, while his ultimate decision to use the device only once before destroying all evidence of its existence provided a form of moral resolution that was notably absent from the real-world nuclear arms race. The scientist's sacrifice of his own life to prevent the oxygen destroyer from being used by others demonstrated a level of personal responsibility that stood in stark contrast to the institutional mechanisms that had enabled atomic weapons proliferation despite the objections of many researchers who had participated in their development. Serizawa's death beneath Tokyo Bay while deploying his weapon against Godzilla provided the film with a tragic hero whose moral courage offered audiences a model for individual ethical action in the face of overwhelming technological and political forces. The monster's death throes in the depths of Tokyo Bay were filmed to emphasize the tragic rather than triumphant aspects of victory, as Godzilla's final moments suggested the destruction of something ancient and irreplaceable rather than the elimination of a simple threat to human safety. The creature's dissolution in the contaminated waters that had become its grave created visual metaphors for the ways that atomic weapons dissolved the boundaries between victor and victim, rendering the very environment uninhabitable for all life forms regardless of their role in the conflicts that had unleashed such forces. Dr. Yamane's warning that additional hydrogen bomb testing might awaken other creatures like Godzilla provided the film with a conclusion that emphasized ongoing danger rather than permanent resolution, reflecting contemporary understanding that atomic weapons had fundamentally altered the relationship between humanity and the natural world in ways that could not be easily reversed. The paleontologist's final words reminded audiences that the monster they had witnessed was not an isolated anomaly, but potentially the first manifestation of consequences that might continue emerging from humanity's atomic experiments for generations to come. The film's Japanese release in November 1954 created an immediate cultural phenomenon that exceeded all expectations for commercial success, while establishing new standards for the treatment of serious themes. Within the monster movie genre, audiences responded to Godzilla not merely as entertainment, but as artistic expression that gave voice to anxieties and experiences that had been difficult to discuss directly within the constraints of contemporary political discourse and social expectations. The critical reception in Japan recognized Honda's achievement in creating a work that functioned simultaneously as spectacular entertainment and profound social commentary, with reviewers praising the film's ability to address atomic themes without exploiting the suffering of bomb survivors or trivializing the ongoing nuclear threats that faced Japanese society. The movie's box office success demonstrated that audiences possessed both the appetite and the sophistication necessary to appreciate entertainment that challenged them to confront difficult truths about their historical experiences and contemporary situation. Yet, the transformation of Gojira for Western audiences would strip away much of the philosophical depth and cultural specificity that had made the original film such a powerful artistic statement. As American distributors sought to maximize commercial appeal through editorial changes that fundamentally altered the work's meaning and impact, the process began in 1956 when producer Joseph E. Levine acquired the rights to create an English-language version that would make the Japanese film accessible to American moviegoers who were presumed to be uninterested in foreign cultural perspectives on atomic weapons and their consequences. The American adaptation, retitled Godzilla, King of the Monsters, represented one of the most comprehensive editorial reconstructions in cinema history, as approximately 60% of Honda's original footage was removed and replaced with newly filmed scenes featuring American actor Raymond Burr as reporter Steve Martin. The character served as a Western observer who could provide English-language narration and reaction shots that would guide American audiences through a story that had been fundamentally restructured to emphasize action and spectacle over thematic depth. The specific elements that were eliminated from the American version included virtually all references to atomic weapons and their effects upon Japanese society, while scenes depicting radiation sickness, contaminated food supplies, and bomb shelters were cut entirely to avoid reminding American audiences of their nation's role in creating the nuclear anxieties that had inspired the original film. The editing process transformed Godzilla from a meditation on atomic warfare into a conventional monster movie that treated the creature as little more than an oversized animal whose rampage could be enjoyed as pure entertainment. The insertion of Raymond Burr's character required extensive manipulation of existing footage through editing techniques that created the illusion of interaction between the American actor and the Japanese performers, despite the fact that Burr had never visited Japan or worked with any of the original cast members. Body doubles and careful camera angles were used to suggest conversations and shared experiences that had never occurred, while Burr's voiceover narration replaced much of the original dialogue that had provided exposition about the monster's atomic origins and symbolic significance. The resulting film bore only superficial resemblance to Honda's original vision, as the complex moral and political themes that had made Gojira a landmark of serious science fiction cinema were reduced to simple explanations for why a giant monster might attack human civilization. American audiences who encountered Godzilla through this heavily edited version were denied access to the philosophical depth and cultural resonance that had made the original film such a powerful artistic achievement. While the movie's commercial success in the United States was built upon a fundamental misunderstanding of what Honda and his collaborators had actually created, the critical reception of the American version reflected this categorical confusion, as reviewers treated the film as a poorly executed monster movie rather than recognizing it as a culturally significant work that had been damaged through insensitive adaptation. The negative reviews that greeted Godzilla, King of the Monsters, established patterns of Western dismissal that would affect perceptions of Japanese science fiction cinema for decades. As critics and audiences developed expectations based upon American editorial decisions rather than the artistic intentions of the original filmmakers, the commercial success of the American adaptation paradoxically ensured that Honda's original vision would remain largely unknown to Western audiences for more than 50 years. As distributors and exhibitors concluded that American viewers preferred simplified versions of foreign films over authentic presentations of international cinema, the precedent established by the Godzilla adaptation would influence the treatment of subsequent Japanese monster movies, as American distributors routinely eliminated cultural context and thematic complexity in favor of action sequences and special effects spectacle. The suppression of the original Gojira from Western markets represented a form of cultural censorship that paralleled the American occupation's restrictions on Japanese discussion of atomic bombing effects, as authentic voices and perspectives were systematically replaced with versions that conformed to American preferences and political sensibilities. The irony of this censorship was that it prevented Western audiences from encountering one of the most powerful artistic responses to atomic warfare ever created, while ensuring that American popular culture's understanding of nuclear themes remained limited to perspectives that reinforced rather than challenged official narratives about atomic weapons and their strategic necessity. The restoration of Honda's original vision for Western audiences would not begin until the 21st century, when changing attitudes toward foreign cinema and growing recognition of Godzilla's cultural significance finally created market conditions that supported authentic presentation of Japanese science fiction classics. The limited theatrical release of the original Gojira in the United States during 2004 marked the beginning of a re-evaluation process that would eventually establish Honda's film as one of the most important works of Gojira Atomic Age cinema, while Criterion Collection's definitive restoration in 2012 provided Western audiences with their first opportunity to experience the movie as its creators had intended. The belated recognition of Gojira's artistic achievements highlighted the cultural losses that occurred when international films were adapted for Western markets through editorial processes that prioritized commercial considerations over artistic integrity, while demonstrating that American audiences possessed greater sophistication and cultural curiosity than distributors had traditionally assumed. The enthusiastic critical reception that greeted the restored version proved that Honda's themes remained relevant to contemporary audiences who faced their own anxieties about nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, and the unintended consequences of technological progress. In the deep places of cinematic memory, where authentic artistic visions struggle against commercial pressures and cultural authenticity confronts the demands of mass entertainment. The original Gojira stands as a testament to the power of genre cinema to address the most serious themes of human experience through the language of fantasy and spectacle. The film's eventual recognition as a masterpiece of atomic age art demonstrates that truth and artistic integrity possess their own forms of persistence that can survive even the most comprehensive attempts at suppression and cases. Distortion. In the year 1955, when the echoes of Godzilla's rampage through Tokyo still reverberated in the dreams of audiences who had witnessed the monster's atomic fury, Toho Studios found themselves confronting the commercial reality that success in the film industry demanded continuation of stories that had captured public imagination, regardless of whether such continuation served the artistic vision that had originally inspired their creation. The sequel that emerged from these pressures, titled Godzilla Raids Again, represented both the inevitable expansion of a profitable franchise and the beginning of a transformation that would ultimately distance the monster from its origins as a symbol of atomic horror. Producer Tomoyuki Tanaka's decision to proceed with an immediate follow-up to the original film was driven primarily by financial considerations rather than artistic inspiration, as the unprecedented success of Gojira had demonstrated that Japanese audiences possessed an appetite for monster cinema that could support ongoing production of similar entertainment. Yet the speed with which the sequel entered production, only months after the original film's release, left insufficient time for the kind of careful thematic development that had made Honda's masterpiece such a powerful cultural statement. The introduction of Anguirus as Godzilla's first opponent established patterns that would define kaiju cinema for decades to come. As the focus shifted from the monster as symbol of human folly to the spectacle of titanic creatures battling each other in urban environments that served primarily as impressive stages for destruction rather than meaningful representations of human civilization. The ankylosaur-inspired design of the new monster reflected Tsuburaya's continued commitment to paleontological accuracy. Yet, Anguirus lacked the symbolic weight that had made Godzilla such a compelling representation of atomic anxiety. The rivalry between the two ancient creatures was presented as a natural conflict between territorial predators rather than a manifestation of humanity's relationship with nuclear forces, marking the beginning of Godzilla's evolution from metaphorical atomic bomb to conventional movie monster whose adventures could be enjoyed without the emotional complexity that had characterized the original film. The battle sequences that dominated the sequel emphasized physical spectacle over thematic resonance, establishing precedents for monster combat that would influence countless subsequent productions. The destruction of Osaka that resulted from the creature's conflict provided impressive visual effects sequences that demonstrated Tsuburaya's continued mastery of miniature work and pyrotechnics. Yet the devastation lacked the emotional weight that had made Tokyo's destruction so affecting in the original film. The civilian casualties and urban destruction were presented as unfortunate but inevitable consequences of monster battles rather than tragic reminders of humanity's vulnerability to forces beyond their control or understanding. Godzilla's apparent death beneath an avalanche at the film's conclusion suggested that Toho had not yet committed to the monster as a permanent franchise character, leaving open the possibility that future films might introduce entirely new creatures rather than continuing to exploit the specific cultural resonance that had made the original Godzilla such a powerful artistic achievement. This narrative flexibility would prove short-lived as commercial considerations increasingly drove creative decisions throughout the following decade. The 7-year hiatus that followed Godzilla Raids Again represented a period during which Japanese cinema underwent significant technological and cultural changes that would profoundly influence the monster's eventual return to the screen. As color film processes became commercially viable and international co-production opportunities created new markets for Japanese entertainment exports. The specific circumstances that would bring Godzilla back to theaters emerged from Hollywood's interest in exploiting the King Kong property through international partnerships that could reduce production costs while expanding global distribution networks. The original concept for King Kong vs. Godzilla had envisioned a meeting between the American giant ape and the Frankenstein monster, reflecting Universal Studios' desire to capitalize on their classic horror properties through modern special effects spectacle that could compete with contemporary science fiction productions. Yet rights complications and technical challenges associated with stop-motion animation led to the substitution of Godzilla for Frankenstein's creature, bringing Honda back to direct what would become the first color Godzilla film and the beginning of the monster's transformation into a more commercially oriented entertainment property. The return of Ishiro Honda to the director's chair provided continuity with the original film's artistic vision. Yet the international co-production requirements and explicitly commercial objectives of the King Kong project pushed the filmmaker toward approaches that emphasized spectacle over the thematic depth that had characterized his earlier work. The decision to present the monster battle in color for the first time created new opportunities for visual spectacle, while simultaneously making the destruction seem less realistic and more fantastical than the somber, black and white imagery that had made the original film so emotionally affecting. The electrical powers that King Kong acquired for this film represented one of the most significant departures from established monster lore, as the giant ape's traditional characterization was modified to create more dramatic battle sequences with Godzilla, while establishing precedents for arbitrary power changes that would become common throughout the franchise's subsequent development. These alterations reflected the increasing influence of commercial considerations over narrative consistency, as each new film sought to provide novel spectacle regardless of whether such innovations served broader storytelling objectives. The popular mythology that King Kong was declared the winner of the titular battle to ensure better box office performance in American markets reflected widespread misunderstanding of Japanese commercial cinema and its relationship to international distribution. Yet the persistence of this legend demonstrated how cultural assumptions could shape audience perceptions of foreign films and their underlying creative motivations. In reality, Kong's victory was determined by narrative considerations related to the character's heroic status rather than marketing calculations. Yet the commercial success of the film established expectations for ongoing monster battles that would define much of Godzilla's subsequent screen career. The success of King Kong vs. Godzilla encouraged Toho to accelerate development of additional kaiju properties that could provide opponents for their atomic dinosaur, while expanding the studio's portfolio of exploitable monster characters, leading to increased emphasis on creature design and battle choreography at the expense of the social commentary that had distinguished the original Gojira from conventional science fiction entertainment. This shift in priorities reflected broader changes within Japanese popular culture as the nation's post-war recovery progressed and audiences became more interested in escapist entertainment than reminders of wartime trauma. The introduction of Mothra as Godzilla's next opponent brought together two of Toho's most successful monster properties, while establishing new precedents for the kinds of stories that kaiju films could tell. As the giant moth's role as protector of an endangered civilization provided moral complexity that had been largely absent from the straightforward monster battles that had dominated recent productions. The film, Mothra vs. Godzilla, represented Honda's attempt to restore some of the thematic weight that had characterized his original atomic monster movie, while adapting to commercial expectations for spectacular creature combat. The infant island sequences that introduced Mothra's fairy guardians created opportunities for social commentary about indigenous rights and environmental exploitation that resonated with contemporary concerns about Japan's rapid industrialization and its effects upon traditional communities, while the monster's role as divine protector provided spiritual dimensions that elevated the story above simple creature feature conventions. The elaborate miniature work required to depict Mothra's aerial battles with Godzilla pushed Tsuburaya's special effects team toward new achievements in wire work and composite photography that would influence monster movie production for decades. The larval Mothra that emerged from eggs laid by the dying adult provided the film with emotional resonance that had been missing from earlier monster battles, as the infant creature's determination to avenge their parent created narrative stakes that extended beyond mere territorial conflict between giant animals. The successful defeat of Godzilla by creatures that were portrayed as noble and sympathetic established precedents for monster characterization that would become increasingly important as the franchise developed more complex mythologies around its various kaiju characters. The introduction of King Ghidorah in Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, marked perhaps the most significant evolutionary step in the Godzilla series, as the Golden Space Dragon's arrival on Earth necessitated an alliance between former enemies that transformed the atomic dinosaur from destructive force into reluctant protector of human civilization. This fundamental character shift represented the complete abandonment of Godzilla's original symbolic function as embodiment of atomic horror, replacing nuclear anxiety with more conventional good versus evil conflicts that could support ongoing series production without requiring audiences to confront uncomfortable truths about warfare and its consequences. The three-way battle between Godzilla, Rodan, and King Ghidorah that dominated the film's climactic sequences established new standards for monster movie spectacle, while demonstrating the technical capabilities that Japanese special effects artists had developed through their work on previous kaiju productions. The elaborate choreography required to coordinate three separate monster suits and their interactions with extensive miniature environments pushed the boundaries of what had been achieved in previous creature features. While the film's international success proved that Japanese monster movies could compete effectively with Hollywood science fiction productions, the transformation of Godzilla from villain to hero within this single film represented a narrative convenience that served commercial objectives while fundamentally altering the character's relationship to the human characters and audiences who had originally understood the monster as a cautionary symbol rather than a source of protection and security. This change would prove irreversible, as subsequent films built upon the precedent of Godzilla as Defender of Earth, gradually erasing the atomic associations that had given the character its original cultural significance. The period that followed saw increasingly rapid production schedules and formulaic approaches to monster movie storytelling as Toho sought to maximize profits from their kaiju properties while minimizing the creative risks that had made the original Gojira such an innovative artistic achievement. Films like Invasion of Astro Monster and Ebera, horror of the deep recycled established monster battle formulas while introducing alien invasion and tropical adventure elements that expanded the series' genre boundaries without adding meaningful thematic depth. The appearance of Manila in Son of Godzilla represented the franchise's most dramatic embrace of child-friendly content, as the introduction of Godzilla's offspring was explicitly designed to appeal to younger audiences while providing merchandising opportunities that could generate revenue streams beyond theatrical exhibition. The infant monster's ability to communicate with human children through telepathic bonds established supernatural elements that had no precedent in the series' atomic origins, while its comedic interactions with its gigantic parent transformed scenes of monster behavior into family-oriented entertainment that bore little resemblance to the terrifying encounters that had characterized earlier films. The increasing emphasis on humor and whimsy that characterized Godzilla's interactions with Manila reflected broader changes in Japanese popular culture as the nation's economic prosperity reduced audiences' interest in serious social commentary while creating demand for entertainment that celebrated rather than questioned technological progress and international cooperation. The monster that had once embodied fears about atomic warfare was gradually transformed into a reassuring father figure whose adventures reinforced rather than challenged conventional family values and social hierarchies. The environmental themes that emerged in Godzilla vs. Hedorah provided temporary restoration of serious social commentary to the franchise. As the smog monster's pollution-based powers addressed contemporary concerns about industrial waste and urban environmental degradation that had become increasingly visible as Japan's economic miracle transformed the nation's physical landscape. The film's explicit anti-pollution message represented Honda's attempt to maintain the series' tradition of addressing contemporary social issues through monster movie metaphors, while its psychedelic visual style reflected the influence of international counterculture movements on Japanese popular entertainment. Yet even this return to thematic relevance was undermined by the film's most famous sequence, in which Godzilla achieved flight by using his atomic breath as a rocket propulsion system, transforming the monster's signature weapon into a source of absurd comedy that reduced the character to the level of cartoon entertainment. This scene epitomized the franchise's complete departure from its origins as serious science fiction cinema, demonstrating how commercial pressures and changing audience expectations had transformed a symbol of atomic horror into a source of juvenile amusement. The production shortcuts and recycled footage that became increasingly common in later Showa period films reflected both budgetary constraints and creative exhaustion as the series struggled to maintain audience interest through repetitive battle sequences and increasingly outlandish plot developments. The reuse of music, sound effects, and even entire action sequences from earlier films created a sense of mechanical formula that was far removed from the careful craftsmanship that had distinguished Tsuburaya's original special effects work and Honda's thoughtful direction. The introduction of Jet Jaguar in Godzilla vs. Megalon through a children's contest winner represented the complete subordination of artistic vision to marketing considerations. As the robot character was designed not to serve narrative purposes, but to appeal to young audiences who might purchase related merchandise and encourage their families to attend theatrical screenings. The hasty production schedule that compressed the film's creation into 3 weeks resulted in special effects work that fell far below the standards established by earlier entries in the series. While the story's emphasis on robot battles rather than monster combat suggested that Toho was already looking beyond the kaiju genre toward other forms of science fiction entertainment. The return of Mechagodzilla in the series' 20th anniversary film provided opportunities for spectacular robot versus monster combat while introducing alien invasion elements that had become standard components of the Fink-Spartad franchise formula. Yet even these elaborate production efforts could not disguise the essential creative bankruptcy that had overcome the series as it struggled to justify its continued existence through increasingly desperate attempts at novelty and spectacle. The mechanical double of Godzilla represented both technological achievement and symbolic acknowledgement that the organic monster had been transformed into something artificial through years of commercial exploitation. The final film of the Showa era, Terror of Mechagodzilla, marked Ishiro Honda's last contribution to the franchise he had helped create, providing the director with an opportunity to reflect upon the distance that separated his original vision from the commercial entertainment that the series had become during its 2-decade evolution. The film's darker tone and more serious treatment of monster combat suggested Honda's awareness that the kaiju genre's golden age had passed, while its commercial failure confirmed that audiences had moved beyond the simple pleasures that monster battles could provide. The decision to end the series after Terror of Mechagodzilla reflected both practical considerations about declining box office returns and creative recognition that the monster movie formula had exhausted its capacity for innovation within the constraints that commercial expectations had established. Godzilla's return to the ocean depths provided appropriate closure for a character whose journey from atomic nightmare to children's entertainment had encompassed most of the major cultural changes that had transformed Japanese society during the post-war Reconstruction period. In the deep places of cinematic memory, where the echoes of Ifukube's original musical themes still resonated with the power to evoke both terror and wonder, the Showa-era Godzilla films remained as documents of a nation's struggle to define its relationship with the atomic age while creating popular entertainment that could provide both profit and catharsis for audiences seeking escape from the complexities of rapid social transformation. The monster's evolution from symbol of destruction to agent of protection paralleled Japan's own transformation from defeated nation to economic powerhouse, while the gradual loss of thematic coherence reflected the challenges that any long-running franchise faced when commercial success required constant innovation without regard for artistic integrity or cultural significance. In the decade of the 1980s, when the world teetered upon the precipice of nuclear annihilation as the Cold War reached its most dangerous phase, and the specter of atomic warfare haunted the collective consciousness of humanity more powerfully than at any time since. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the king of monsters stirred from his decade-long slumber beneath the Pacific depths to confront a world that had changed dramatically since his last appearance on cinema screens. The Godzilla who would emerge from this extended hibernation bore little resemblance to the child-friendly protector who had concluded the Showa era, as the cultural anxieties that had originally given birth to the atomic dinosaur had returned with renewed intensity to demand artistic expression that could match the gravity of contemporary nuclear threats. The geopolitical landscape of the early 1980s was dominated by escalating tensions between the United States and Soviet Union that had transformed the theoretical possibility of nuclear warfare into an immediate and tangible threat to human civilization, as both superpowers engaged in arms races that produced increasingly sophisticated delivery systems and more powerful warheads capable of destroying all life on Earth multiple times over. The deployment of intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe and the development of strategic defense initiatives created hair-trigger situations where technical malfunctions or communication failures could trigger global catastrophe within minutes of the initial alert. Against this backdrop of mounting nuclear anxiety, the Japanese public found themselves confronting their unique position as the only nation to have experienced atomic attack, while simultaneously hosting American military bases that made them potential targets for Soviet nuclear strikes in the event of superpower conflict. The peace movement that had emerged from the Lucky Dragon incident 3 decades earlier had evolved into a sophisticated anti-nuclear campaign that connected local environmental concerns with global disarmament efforts, creating cultural conditions that were remarkably similar to those that had inspired the original Gojira. The decision to revive Godzilla after 9 years of dormancy was driven by Toho's recognition that contemporary nuclear fears provided opportunities for serious monster movie making that had been absent during the more optimistic periods of Japan's economic miracle, when audiences had preferred escapist entertainment to reminders of atomic dangers. Producer Tomoyuki Tanaka understood that the cultural moment was appropriate for returning the character to its origins as a symbol of nuclear horror. While advances in special effects, technology offered new possibilities for depicting destruction that could surpass even Eiji Tsuburaya's pioneering work from the 1950s. The production that would become The Return of Godzilla was conceived as a direct sequel to the original 1954 film, deliberately ignoring all subsequent entries in the series to restore the monster's status as a unique and terrifying force rather than one participant in an ongoing series of creature battles. This radical approach to franchise continuity reflected the filmmakers' understanding that Godzilla's symbolic power had been diluted through decades of commercial exploitation, and that meaningful restoration of the character's cultural significance required abandoning the comfortable formulas that had sustained the Showa-era productions. Director Koji Hashimoto brought to the project a commitment to practical special effects work that honored Tsuburaya's legacy while incorporating modern techniques that could enhance the illusion of massive scale and destructive power. The decision to increase Godzilla's size from 50 meters to 80 meters was motivated by the need to make the monster appear appropriately threatening when filmed against Tokyo's dramatically expanded skyline. As the city's transformation into a modern metropolis of glass and steel towers required corresponding adjustments to the creature's proportions to maintain the visual impact that urban destruction scenes had achieved in earlier films. The design philosophy that guided Godzilla's new appearance emphasized the monster's role as a living embodiment of nuclear forces rather than a sympathetic character with whom audiences might identify. As special effects director Teruyoshi Nakano sought to create a creature whose every feature suggested the alien and terrifying nature of atomic energy unleashed in biological form. The monster's movements were choreographed to emphasize deliberate menace rather than the more playful behaviors that had characterized the later Showa films, while its atomic breath was enhanced through new optical effects that made the weapon appear more destructive and realistic than previous depictions. The integration of sophisticated animatronics into Godzilla's portrayal represented significant technological advancement over the purely suit-based performances that had defined earlier films. As close-up shots of the monster's head and facial expressions achieved levels of detail and emotional nuance that had been impossible using traditional techniques alone. These mechanical enhancements allowed for more subtle performances that could convey the creature's intelligence and malevolent intent without resorting to anthropomorphic behaviors that might undermine its fundamental alienness. The film's plot structure deliberately echoed the original Gojira while updating its themes to address contemporary nuclear concerns, as Godzilla's emergence from the Pacific was connected to modern submarine activities rather than atomic testing, reflecting changed geopolitical realities while maintaining the causal relationship between human military activities and monster appearances. The creature's attack upon a Soviet nuclear submarine introduced Cold War tensions directly into the narrative, creating scenarios where the monster's actions could trigger international incidents that might escalate into global nuclear warfare. The inclusion of American and Soviet military responses to the Godzilla threat provided opportunities for political commentary about superpower rivalry and the ways that nuclear competition had transformed local disasters into potential catalysts for worldwide destruction, as both nations' representatives were more concerned with protecting their strategic interests than with addressing the immediate threat to Japanese civilians. These sequences reflected contemporary Japanese anxieties about being caught between competing superpowers whose military policies treated Japan as a strategic asset rather than a sovereign nation with its own security interests. The Super X aircraft that served as Japan's primary weapon against Godzilla represented the nation's technological capabilities while symbolizing the limitations of conventional military responses to nuclear threats, as even the most advanced conventional weapons proved inadequate when confronted with forces that operated according to atomic rather than chemical or kinetic principles. The aircraft's eventual defeat by Godzilla's atomic breath reinforced themes about the futility of attempting to control nuclear forces through traditional military means, while its pilot's courage provided human heroism that could inspire audiences without suggesting that individual bravery could overcome systemic nuclear dangers. The film's climactic sequences, which depicted Godzilla's rampage through modern Tokyo's business district, were choreographed and filmed to maximize their impact upon audiences who understood that the destruction they were witnessing represented a preview of what nuclear warfare would inflict upon contemporary urban populations. The collapse of skyscrapers and the evacuation of civilian populations from contaminated areas provided visual metaphors for atomic attack scenarios that had become increasingly realistic possibilities during the heightened tensions of the post early 1980s. The monster's ultimate return to the ocean depths at the film's conclusion avoided the triumphant resolution that had characterized many Showa-era entries, instead suggesting that nuclear threats remained dormant rather than eliminated, waiting to be awakened by future human activities that might disturb forces beyond mortal understanding or control. This ambiguous ending reflected contemporary recognition that nuclear dangers were permanent features of modern life, rather than problems that could be permanently solved through technological or military means. The commercial success of The Return of Godzilla in Japan demonstrated that audiences retained their appetite for serious science fiction cinema that addressed contemporary anxieties, while international distribution challenges revealed the ongoing difficulties that Japanese filmmakers faced when attempting to present their cultural perspectives to foreign markets that preferred simplified entertainment over complex political commentary. The film's limited overseas release ensured that its nuclear themes reached primarily domestic audiences who possessed the cultural context necessary to fully appreciate its symbolic dimensions. The critical reception of the film in Japan praised Hashimoto's return to the serious tone that had distinguished Honda's original work, while recognizing that advances in special effects technology had created new possibilities for depicting monster attacks with unprecedented realism and emotional impact. The restoration of Godzilla's status as a terrifying force of destruction rather than a heroic protector was welcomed by critics who had grown weary of the franchise's descent into juvenile entertainment during its previous incarnation. The success of The Return of Godzilla encouraged Toho to proceed with additional entries that could explore different aspects of nuclear anxiety while maintaining the serious approach that had distinguished the reboot from its immediate predecessors. Yet commercial pressures and audience expectations would gradually push subsequent films toward the monster battle formulas that had proven successful during the Showa era, albeit with more sophisticated production values and more complex thematic elements than had characterized the earlier period's more straightforward approach to kaiju storytelling. The development of Godzilla vs. Biollante represented both creative innovation and commercial calculation, as the film's genetic engineering themes addressed contemporary scientific developments, while providing opportunities for spectacular creature battles that could satisfy audience expectations for monster movie spectacle. The plant monster created through the combination of Godzilla's genetic material with Rose DNA and human consciousness represented a new category of kaiju that reflected scientific anxieties about biotechnology and genetic manipulation that had become increasingly prominent during the 1980s. The film's emphasis on corporate espionage and international competition for genetic research data introduced elements of contemporary techno-thriller cinema into the kaiju genre, while its exploration of grief and memory through the scientist character who had incorporated his dead daughter's psyche into the monster provided emotional complexity that elevated the story above simple creature feature conventions. The psychic connection between the human characters and the plant monster suggested that genetic engineering could create relationships that transcended species boundaries while raising questions about the ethical implications of manipulating life at the molecular level. The commercial disappointment of Godzilla vs. Biollante, despite its critical acclaim and innovative approach to monster movie making, demonstrated that audiences preferred familiar formulas to experimental narrative structures, leading Toho to return to established kaiju characters for subsequent entries that could guarantee box office success, while maintaining the production values and thematic sophistication that had distinguished the Heisei era from its Kaina predecessors. This tension between creative innovation and commercial viability would characterize the remainder of the series as filmmakers sought to balance artistic ambition with audience expectations. The return of King Ghidorah in the third Heisei film provided opportunities for spectacular monster battles while introducing time travel elements that allowed the filmmakers to explore alternative versions of history in which key events had unfolded differently, creating narrative complexity that distinguished the story from simple rematch scenarios while addressing contemporary Japanese concerns about historical memory and national identity. The revelation that Godzilla had originated as a dinosaur that survived on Lagos Island during World War II before being mutated by atomic testing provided new mythological depth to the monster's origins while connecting its existence directly to Japan's wartime experiences. The controversial portrayal of American military personnel in the film's historical sequences generated diplomatic tensions that affected the movie's international distribution, as scenes depicting American soldiers being attacked by the future Godzilla were interpreted by some Western commentators as anti-American propaganda rather than legitimate artistic exploration of historical what-if scenarios. These controversies highlighted the ongoing challenges that Japanese filmmakers faced when attempting to address wartime history through popular entertainment, while demonstrating that monster movies could generate serious political discussions when their themes intersected with sensitive historical issues. The time travel paradox that served as the film's central plot device allowed for complex narrative structures that elevated the story above simple monster battle conventions, while the Futurians' attempt to prevent Japan's economic dominance by eliminating Godzilla from history provided science fiction frameworks for exploring contemporary anxieties about Japan's international economic position. During the height of the bubble economy period, the failure of the time traveler's plan and the creation of an even more powerful King Ghidorah reinforced themes about the unintended consequences of attempting to manipulate historical forces for contemporary political purposes. The spectacular success of Godzilla vs. Mothra established the film as the highest-grossing entry in the Heisei series while demonstrating that environmental themes could provide compelling frameworks for monster movie narratives that addressed contemporary concerns about ecological destruction and corporate environmental irresponsibility. The updated Mothra design and mythology connected the giant moth to contemporary environmental protection movements while maintaining the character's traditional role as a benevolent force that opposed destructive human activities. The introduction of Batra as Mothra's dark counterpart provided moral complexity that elevated the story above simple good versus evil conflicts, as the Black Moth's role as Earth's more aggressive environmental protector suggested that planetary defense might require methods that extended beyond the gentle persuasion that characterized Mothra's traditional approach to human nature conflicts. The three-way battle between Godzilla, Mothra, and Batra created spectacular action sequences while exploring different philosophical approaches to environmental protection and species survival. The film's commercial success occurred during the final period of Ishiro Honda's life, as the original Godzilla director's declining health prevented him from contributing to the series he had created while allowing him to observe from a distance the ways that contemporary filmmakers were adapting his creation to address modern concerns. Honda's reported visit to the film's set shortly before his death provided symbolic closure to his relationship with the character, while passing creative responsibility to a new generation of directors who understood both the Seishin commercial potential and cultural significance of the atomic monster. The decision to continue the series beyond Honda's death reflected both commercial opportunities and creative obligations to honor the legacy that the original director had established, as subsequent films sought to balance respect for the character's symbolic origins with audience expectations for increasingly sophisticated special effects and more complex narrative structures that could distinguish modern kaiju cinema from its predecessors, while maintaining connection to the thematic elements that had given the franchise its cultural significance. The return of Mechagodzilla in the fourth Heisei film provided opportunities for spectacular robot versus monster combat, while exploring themes about technology's relationship to natural forces, as the mechanical duplicate constructed from the original Godzilla's remains suggested that human attempts to control atomic forces through technological means remained problematic, even when such efforts incorporated organic elements that might provide greater compatibility with biological systems. The Garuda support craft and its eventual combination with Mechagodzilla demonstrated Japanese technological capabilities while maintaining the series' traditional emphasis on teamwork and cooperation in confronting existential threats. The psychic connection between the human pilot and the mechanical Godzilla introduced supernatural elements that had been largely absent from the more scientifically grounded Heisei entries, while the tragic fate of the pilot provided emotional weight that elevated the story above simple technological spectacle toward more complex explorations of the costs that individuals paid when they became components in larger systems, designed to protect society from external threats. The film's success ensured that Mechagodzilla would return for additional appearances while establishing patterns for human-machine integration that would influence subsequent science fiction productions. The direct sequel, Tokyo SOS, provided continuation of the Mechagodzilla story while reintroducing Mothra in her traditional role as spiritual guardian, whose concerns extended beyond immediate threats to encompass longer-term questions about the ethical implications of using the remains of sacred creatures for military purposes. The giant moth's anger about humanity's desecration of Godzilla's bones provided religious and cultural dimensions that connected contemporary monster movie making to traditional Japanese spiritual beliefs about the proper treatment of the dead and the consequences of disturbing sacred remains. The space-based origins of Space Godzilla in the penultimate Heisei film provided opportunities for cosmic scope that expanded the series' mythological framework while incorporating elements from earlier entries through the past. Creatures' connection to both Biollante and Mothra, whose genetic material had been carried into space by previous monster battles to undergo transformation through exposure to cosmic forces that operated according to different physical laws than those that govern terrestrial evolution. The crystalline powers and space-based abilities of the new monster created spectacular visual effects opportunities while suggesting that the kaiju universe extended far beyond Earth's boundaries. The film's exploration of psychic abilities and their military applications through the character of Miki Saigusa provided ongoing human story elements that connected the various Heisei entries while addressing contemporary concerns about government research into paranormal phenomena and their potential weaponization for national security purposes. The psychic's growing relationship with Godzilla throughout the series created emotional bonds that humanized the monster while maintaining its essential alienness. As the telepathic communication between human and kaiju suggested possibilities for interspecies understanding that transcended conventional categories of predator and prey. The final entry in the Heisei series, Godzilla vs. Destroyer, was conceived as the definitive conclusion to the Atomic Monster's screen career, as Toho's announcement of Godzilla's planned death generated international media attention and fan reactions that demonstrated the character's global cultural significance 4 decades after its original creation. The decision to kill off the monster reflected both creative desires for meaningful closure and commercial recognition that the character's cultural impact had reached levels that warranted ceremonial conclusion rather than indefinite continuation. The Oxygen Destroyer connection that linked Destroyer to the original 1954 film provided thematic unity that brought the Heisei series full circle, while demonstrating that the consequences of humanity's weapons development could continue manifesting decades after their initial deployment as the microorganisms that had evolved from exposure to Dr. Tethys. Serizawa's creation represented delayed effects that paralleled the ongoing medical consequences of atomic testing and nuclear accidents. The multiple forms that Destroyer assumed during its development created spectacular battle sequences, while suggesting evolutionary processes that operated according to artificial rather than natural selection pressures. Godzilla's nuclear meltdown provided the series with its most powerful metaphor for atomic anxiety since the original film. As the monster's transformation into a walking nuclear reactor, whose death could potentially destroy all life on Earth, represented contemporary fears about nuclear accidents and their global consequences that had been amplified by disasters like Chernobyl. The creature's gradual physical deterioration and eventual death created emotional resonance that elevated the story above simple monster battle conventions toward genuine tragedy that honored both the character's symbolic significance and the real-world nuclear concerns that had inspired its creation. The passing of atomic fire from the dying Godzilla to his offspring provided symbolic continuity that suggested regeneration and renewal rather than permanent ending, while Junior's growth into full adult size demonstrated that the forces represented by the atomic monster were eternal aspects of the nuclear age rather than problems that could be permanently solved through military action or technological intervention. The new Godzilla's final roar that concluded the series echoed across 4 decades of cultural history, while promising that the atomic monster's symbolic significance would endure for future generations who would face their own versions of nuclear anxiety and environmental crisis. In the deep places of atomic memory, where the shadows of Hiroshima and Nagasaki still burned with radioactive fire, and the dreams of peaceful nuclear energy mingled with nightmares of global annihilation, the Heisei-era Godzilla films stood as monuments to humanity's ongoing struggle with the forces they had unleashed but could never fully control. While demonstrating that monster movies could serve as vehicles for serious social commentary when filmmakers possessed both the technical skills and moral courage necessary to address the most challenging aspects of modern existence. Through the transformative power of cinematic myth and spectacular imagination. In the waning years of the 20th century, when the nuclear anxieties that had defined the Cold War were gradually giving way to new forms of global uncertainty, and the Japanese economy had reached heights of prosperity that seemed to promise eternal expansion, the ancient forces that had once threatened humanity with atomic annihilation found themselves confronted by an entirely different kind of destructive power. The commercial ambitions of Hollywood entertainment conglomerates, whose appetite for international properties knew no boundaries, and whose confidence in their ability to improve upon foreign artistic achievements exceeded even their capacity for spectacular failure. The transformation of Godzilla from symbol of atomic horror into American blockbuster entertainment began in the corporate boardrooms of TriStar Pictures, where executives who possessed neither understanding of nor respect for the cultural significance that the monster held within Japanese society made decisions that would fundamentally alter the character's meaning while demonstrating the profound challenges that arose when artistic properties were translated across cultural boundaries by individuals whose primary concerns were financial rather than aesthetic or symbolic. Roland Emmerich's assumption of directorial control over the American Godzilla project represented the triumph of technological spectacle over thematic depth. As the filmmaker whose previous works had emphasized visual effects and disaster scenarios over character development or social commentary, approached the atomic monster as an engineering problem to be solved through superior special effects, rather than a cultural symbol whose significance required careful preservation and respectful adaptation for international audiences who might lack the historical context that had given the character its original power. The fundamental philosophical differences between Emmerich's vision and the traditions established by Ishiro Honda and his collaborators became apparent during the earliest stages of pre-production, as the American director expressed explicit disinterest in maintaining connections to the monster's atomic origins or symbolic functions, preferring instead to create what he characterized as a more realistic creature whose appearance and behavior would conform to contemporary scientific understanding of reptilian biology rather than the metaphorical requirements that had shaped the character's original design and cinematic presentation. The decision to redesign Godzilla as an oversized iguana rather than a dinosaurian titan reflected both Emmerich's commitment to biological plausibility and his fundamental misunderstanding of the ways that monster movies could function as vehicles for social commentary. As the new creature's terrestrial origins and reproductive capabilities transformed it from a unique atomic aberration into a conventional animal whose threat to human civilization was quantifiable and ultimately manageable through appropriate military responses and scientific intervention. The speed and agility that characterized the American Godzilla's movement patterns represented deliberate departures from the deliberate, implacable advance that had made the original monster so terrifying. As Emmerich sought to create action sequences that would appeal to contemporary audiences who expected rapid pacing and kinetic excitement rather than the building dread and inevitable destruction that had distinguished Honda's approach to monster movie storytelling from conventional action cinema formulas. The nesting behavior that drove much of the film's plot development transformed Godzilla from solitary force of destruction into protective parent whose actions could be understood through familiar biological imperatives, while the numerous offspring that hatched within Madison Square Garden provided opportunities for chase sequences that deliberately echoed the velociraptor encounters from Jurassic Park, rather than exploring the unique possibilities that the Godzilla concept offered for examining humanity's relationship with atomic forces and their unintended consequences. The marketing campaign that preceded the film's release promised audiences spectacular destruction and state-of-the-art special effects while carefully avoiding detailed revelation of the creature's new appearance or capabilities, creating anticipation based upon the cultural recognition that the Godzilla name carried rather than the specific artistic vision that Emmerich had developed for his interpretation of the character. The teaser trailers that showed only the monster's foot-crushing museum displays and creating massive footprints in urban environments built excitement through suggestion rather than explicit demonstration of the ways that the American version differed from its Japanese predecessors. The critical and commercial reception that greeted the film upon its May 1998 release revealed the extent to which audience expectations had been shaped by 4 decades of Japanese Godzilla movies. As viewers who anticipated encounters with an atomic dinosaur of mythic proportions found themselves confronted instead with an oversized reptile whose behavior patterns and vulnerability to conventional weapons reduced it to the level of a large but ultimately manageable animal problem, rather than an existential threat to human civilization. The comparison to Jurassic Park's creatures that dominated critical discussion of the film reflected both the obvious similarities in creature design and movement, as well as the broader cultural context within which American monster movies were being produced during the 1990s. As advances in computer-generated imagery had created new possibilities for depicting realistic animal behavior, while simultaneously encouraging filmmakers to pursue biological plausibility over the symbolic abstraction that had given earlier monster movies their mythological power and cultural resonance. The fan rejection that quickly crystallized around the acronym GENO, meaning Godzilla in name only, demonstrated the depth of emotional investment that international audiences had developed in the character's traditional appearance and behavior patterns. while highlighting the risks that commercial enterprises faced when they attempted to radically alter beloved cultural properties without adequate consideration of the elements that had made such properties meaningful to their original audiences across multiple generations of moviegoers. The commercial success that the film achieved despite its critical reception and fan hostility revealed the power of brand recognition and marketing expenditure to generate theatrical attendance regardless of artistic quality. While the rapid abandonment of planned sequels demonstrated that short-term commercial gains could not sustain franchise development when the fundamental creative vision failed to connect with audiences who possessed other options for similar entertainment experiences. Toho's response to the American adaptation came with remarkable speed, as the Japanese studio announced new Godzilla production plans within months of the TriStar film's release, demonstrating both their awareness of the damage that the Hollywood version had inflicted upon the character's reputation and their determination to restore the monster to its proper cultural context through films that would honor the traditions established by Honda and his collaborators while incorporating modern production techniques that could compete with contemporary international cinema. Godzilla 2000 represented both artistic reclamation and commercial calculation, as the film's title explicitly positioned it as the definitive millennial Godzilla movie, while its content deliberately emphasized elements that had been absent from the American adaptation, including the creature's atomic origins, indestructible nature, and role as a force of nature beyond human control or understanding. The decision to produce the film as a complete reboot that ignored all previous continuity allowed the filmmakers maximum freedom to define their vision without being constrained by the accumulated mythology of earlier entries. The monster's updated design reflected advances in special effects technology while maintaining visual continuity with the character's classic appearance, as the larger size and more detailed skin texture created impressive on-screen presence without fundamentally altering the elements that made Godzilla recognizable to international audiences who had been disappointed by the radical changes that characterized the American version. The integration of computer-generated imagery with traditional suitmation techniques demonstrated that Japanese filmmakers could employ modern technology while preserving the practical effects work that had distinguished their productions from Hollywood spectacle. The UFO elements that provided the film's primary antagonist reflected contemporary science fiction trends, while offering opportunities for spectacular destruction sequences that could showcase both Godzilla's power and the prover advanced special effects capabilities that Japanese cinema had developed during the decades since the previous domestic production. The alien creature's ability to regenerate and adapt to different situations provided worthy opposition for Godzilla, while avoiding the repetitive monster battle formulas that had characterized many earlier entries in the franchise. The international distribution that brought Godzilla 2000 to American theaters marked the first time that a Japanese Godzilla film had received wide theatrical release in the United States since the early 1960s, demonstrating both the global appetite for authentic kaiju entertainment and the commercial viability of subtitled foreign films when they offered experiences that could not be replicated through domestic production. The positive reception that greeted the film among American critics and audiences who had been disappointed by the TriStar version validated Toho's decision to maintain production control while seeking international distribution partnerships. The success of Godzilla 2000 encouraged Toho to continue Millennium period production with additional entries that could explore different approaches to updating the character for contemporary audiences, leading to an experimental phase during which nearly every film served as a complete reboot that offered new interpretations of the monster's origins and significance, rather than building upon established continuity that might limit creative flexibility or alienate newcomers who lacked familiarity with previous entries. Godzilla vs. Megaguirus represented the series' most comprehensive embrace of computer-generated imagery to that point. As the swarm of prehistoric dragonflies that served as the film's primary threat required digital animation techniques that would have been impossible to achieve through traditional special effects methods, while their energy-draining abilities provided opportunities for spectacular visual effects sequences that demonstrated the potential for combining classical kaiju concepts with modern technological capabilities. The time travel elements that connected the film to contemporary energy research and urban development projects provided social commentary about Japan's ongoing economic transformation while maintaining the series' tradition of time-steady film. Addressing contemporary concerns through science fiction frameworks that could make complex issues accessible to general audiences. The artificial black hole technology that drove the plot reflected contemporary scientific speculation while offering destructive spectacle that could rival any previous Godzilla film. The mixed reception that greeted the film reflected both appreciation for its technical achievements and criticism of its convoluted plot structure. As the time travel paradoxes and multiple antagonist creatures created narrative complexity that sometimes obscured rather than enhanced the basic pleasures that audiences sought from monster movie entertainment. The lesson that emerged from this mixed success was that technological innovation alone could not compensate for weak storytelling or unclear thematic focus. The radical departure, represented by Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, giant monsters' all-out attack demonstrated the creative possibilities that the reboot approach offered for exploring different aspects of the character's cultural significance. As director Shusuke Kaneko transformed Godzilla from heroic protector into malevolent force driven by the spirits of Japan's war dead to seek vengeance against a nation that had forgotten the suffering it had inflicted upon other peoples during its period of imperial expansion. The explicitly anti-war themes that drove the film's narrative represented the most direct political commentary that any Godzilla movie had attempted since the original Gojira, while the transformation of traditional monster allies into adversaries created moral complexity that elevated the story above simple good versus evil conflicts toward more nuanced examinations of historical guilt and collective responsibility for past actions. The smaller size and reduced power levels assigned to Mothra, King Ghidorah, and Baragon reflected the film's emphasis on spiritual rather than physical conflict. The spectacular destruction sequences that dominated the film's climactic battles were choreographed and filmed to emphasize the tragic rather than exciting aspects of urban devastation, as civilian casualties and infrastructure collapse were presented as genuine disasters rather than entertaining spectacle, reflecting Kaneko's commitment to treating monster attacks as serious threats rather than opportunities for action movie thrills that divorced destruction from its human consequences. The commercial success that the film achieved, despite its serious themes, demonstrated that Japanese audiences remained receptive to monster movies that addressed contemporary social and political issues through fantastic premises. While international critics praised the film's willingness to use popular entertainment formats for meaningful cultural commentary rather than simple escapism that avoided engagement with challenging historical and moral questions. The return of Mechagodzilla in Godzilla against Mechagodzilla provided opportunities for spectacular robot versus monster combat while exploring themes about technology's relationship to memory and identity. As the mechanical creature constructed from the original Godzilla's bones suggested that human attempts to control atomic forces through technological means remained problematic, even when such efforts incorporated organic elements that might provide greater compatibility with biological systems that had been shaped by millions of years of evolutionary development. The Kiryu saga that encompassed both Godzilla against Mechagodzilla and its direct sequel, Tokyo SOS, represented the Millennium period's most successful attempt at creating interconnected storylines that could build character development and thematic depth across multiple films, while maintaining the spectacular action sequences that audiences expected from modern monster movies. The psychic connection between the human pilot and the mechanical Godzilla provided emotional stakes that elevated the robot battles above simple technological spectacle. The tragic sacrifice that concluded the Kiryu storyline provided emotional resolution that honored both the organic Godzilla's status as a force of nature and the mechanical version's artificial consciousness, while demonstrating that meaningful relationships could develop between humans and their technological creations when such relationships were built upon mutual respect rather than simple domination and control of advanced systems designed primarily for destructive purposes. The final entry in the Millennium series, Godzilla: Final Wars, was conceived as the ultimate celebration of the franchise's 50-year history, bringing together monsters and elements from across the entire run of films while providing spectacular action sequences that would serve as a definitive farewell to the character before an announced hiatus that would allow the series to rest while Toho evaluated future possibilities for kaiju entertainment in an increasingly competitive global market. The film's ambitious scope encompassed alien invasion, mutant humans with superhuman abilities, and monster battles on a global scale that demonstrated both the creative possibilities inherent in the kaiju concept and the practical challenges involved in creating coherent narratives from such diverse elements without losing focus on the character relationships and thematic concerns that gave monster movies their emotional resonance beyond simple spectacle and destruction. The appearance of the American Godzilla as Zilla in a brief sequence that resulted in its immediate destruction by the authentic Japanese monster provided both fan service and symbolic statement about Toho's attitude toward foreign interpretations of their cultural property, while demonstrating that corporate politics and artistic integrity could sometimes align in ways that produce satisfying dramatic moments, even when they emerge from commercial rather than purely creative motivations. The disappointing box office performance that Final Wars achieved, despite its elaborate production values and comprehensive fan service elements, suggested that audiences had grown weary of the constant rebooting and reimagining that had characterized the Millennium period, while critics noted that the film's emphasis on action and spectacle had come at the expense of the thematic depth and emotional engagement that had distinguished the series' most successful entries throughout its history. The decision to place Godzilla on indefinite hiatus following Final Wars reflected both practical considerations about the character's commercial viability in contemporary markets and creative recognition that the constant reinvention approach had exhausted its capacity for generating fresh approaches to familiar material without fundamental changes in the cultural context that had originally given the atomic monster its significance as a symbol of nuclear anxiety and environmental destruction. In the deep places of cinematic memory, where the echoes of authentic cultural expression struggled against the homogenizing forces of global commercial entertainment and the original artistic vision that had created a monster from atomic fire competed with the simplified formulas that reduced complex cultural symbols to easily exportable action movie components. The Millennium period stood as both testament to the creative possibilities inherent in the kaiju concept and warning about the dangers that arose when commercial pressures overwhelmed the thematic coherence that had given monster movies their power to address the deepest fears and anxieties of the societies that created them. In the second decade of the 21st century, when the world had grown accustomed to the perpetual anxieties of global terrorism and economic uncertainty, while the nuclear fears that had once dominated international relations seemed relegated to the abstract concerns of policy, experts and aging Cold War veterans, two catastrophic events would converge to awaken dormant atomic nightmares and demonstrate that the forces which had originally given birth to the King of Monsters remained as relevant and terrifying as they had been during the darkest days of the 1950s, when Japanese audiences first witnessed their cultural trauma transformed into cinematic mythology. The earthquake that struck off the coast of Japan on March 11, 2011, registered 9.0 on the Richter scale, making it the most powerful seismic event ever recorded in the nation's history and the fourth most powerful earthquake documented anywhere on Earth since modern measurement techniques had been developed. The massive displacement of oceanic water that followed generated tsunami waves reaching heights of over 130 feet in some areas, traveling at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour as they raced across the Pacific toward coastal communities that had barely 6 minutes warning before the first walls of water began their assault upon everything that human back is. Civilization had constructed during centuries of patient development along the shores of northeastern Honshu. The immediate devastation was beyond the comprehension of observers who had never witnessed natural forces operating at such scale and with such concentrated destructive power, as entire towns were swept away in minutes, while the carefully maintained agricultural lands that had sustained local communities for generations were transformed into debris-filled lakes that would remain contaminated and unusable. For decades to come, the official death toll would eventually reach nearly 16,000 souls. Yet this number represented only the beginning of consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate impact zone to encompass national and international implications that had been unimaginable before the disaster struck. Yet even as rescue workers struggled to reach survivors trapped beneath the rubble of collapsed buildings and coastal communities grappled with the complete destruction of their physical infrastructure, a far more insidious disaster was beginning to unfold at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, where the tsunami's assault upon backup power systems had initiated a cascade of mechanical failures that would ultimately result in nuclear meltdowns at 3 separate reactors and the release of radioactive materials into the radioactive mine meltdowns. Environment on a scale not witnessed since the Chernobyl disaster 25 years earlier. The irony that Japan, the only nation to have suffered atomic attack and the birthplace of the world's most famous atomic monster, should find itself confronting a new nuclear catastrophe was not lost upon observers who understood the cultural and historical significance of atomic energy within Japanese society. While the government's initial attempts to minimize public discussion of radiation risks echoed the censorship policies that had prevented open examination of atomic bomb effects during the post-war occupation period. The evacuation zones that expanded outward from the damaged nuclear facility created exclusion areas reminiscent of science fiction scenarios, where human habitation became impossible due to invisible contamination that would persist for generations. The psychological impact of the Fukushima disaster upon Japanese society extended far beyond the immediate radiation risks, as the revelation that modern safety systems could fail so completely when confronted with natural forces reawakened fears about humanity's relationship with atomic technology that many had believed had been permanently resolved. Through decades of peaceful nuclear development and stringent safety regulations, the images of hydrogen explosions destroying reactor buildings provided visual echoes of atomic detonations that resonated with cultural memories stretching back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while the ongoing contamination of agricultural products and marine life created new versions of the pollution fears that had inspired the original Godzilla's creation. Against this backdrop of renewed nuclear anxiety and environmental catastrophe, the decision by Legendary Pictures to pursue a new American interpretation of Godzilla represented both commercial opportunity and cultural responsibility. As the studio's executives recognized that contemporary audiences might be ready for monster movie entertainment that addressed serious themes rather than providing simple escapist spectacle divorced from real-world concerns about technology's capacity for creating unintended consequences that could threaten human civilization. Director Gareth Edwards brought to the project a background in low-budget independent filmmaking that had taught him the value of suggestion and restraint over explicit spectacle, while his previous work on monsters had demonstrated his ability to create emotionally resonant science fiction cinema that treated its fantastic elements with the seriousness and respect that had been largely absent from contemporary fantasy. American genre filmmaking. Edwards understood that Godzilla's cultural significance extended far beyond its function as a source of spectacular destruction, encompassing symbolic dimensions that required careful handling to maintain their power and relevance. The decision to present Godzilla as a force of natural balance rather than simple destruction reflected both Edwards' understanding of the character's role within Japanese mythology and his recognition that contemporary environmental concerns provided frameworks for updating the monster's significance without losing connection to the atomic themes that had originally inspired its creation. The Mutos that served as the film's primary antagonists were designed to embody humanity's disruption of natural systems, while Godzilla's role as their ancient nemesis positioned the titular monster as nature's response to threats that human activity had awakened but could not control. The nuclear themes that drove the film's plot development maintained explicit connections to both historical atomic testing and contemporary nuclear power concerns, as the creatures feeding upon radioactive materials provided direct links to Fukushima-style disasters, while their origins in atomic bomb testing echoed the circumstances that had created the original Japanese monster. The military's attempt to destroy all the creatures through nuclear weapons provided opportunities for moral complexity that distinguished the story from simple monster battle entertainment. The reverent approach that Edwards took toward depicting Godzilla's physical presence emphasized the creature's massive scale and ancient dignity rather than its capacity for destruction, as long shots and partial glimpses built anticipation while suggesting that the monster represented forces too vast and powerful to be fully comprehended by human observers whose perspective remained necessarily limited by their own scale and mortality. The famous airport sequence that revealed only the creature's feet created awe rather than terror, positioning Godzilla as a natural wonder rather than a simple threat. The atomic breath sequence that served as the film's climactic revelation was choreographed and filmed to emphasize the weapon's connection to nuclear forces while avoiding the celebratory tone that had characterized many previous depictions of the monster's signature ability, as the blue-white energy that emerged from Godzilla's throat suggested both ancient power and contemporary atomic dangers without reducing either element to simple special effects, spectacle divorced from thematic significance. The film's critical and commercial success in the United States demonstrated that American audiences retained their appetite for serious science fiction cinema that addressed contemporary concerns through fantastic premises, while international reception confirmed that Edwards' respectful approach to the source material had satisfied fans who had been disappointed by previous attempts to adapt Japanese cultural properties for Western consumption. The movie's box office performance justified Legendary's investment while establishing foundations for the expanded monsterverse that would bring together multiple kaiju properties under unified creative management. The establishment of Monarch as the secret organization responsible for studying and monitoring giant creatures provided narrative frameworks for connecting Godzilla to other monster properties while addressing contemporary concerns about government secrecy and the extent to which official institutions concealed information about threats that might affect civilian populations. The organization's decades-long cover-up of kaiju existence paralleled real-world controversies about nuclear testing secrecy and environmental contamination cover-ups that had characterized government responses to atomic disasters throughout the Cold War period. Meanwhile, in Japan, the cultural trauma of the Fukushima disaster had created conditions remarkably similar to those that had inspired the original Gojira 60 years earlier. As a nation grappled with atomic contamination while confronting government and corporate institutions whose responses to nuclear crisis seemed inadequate to address the scope of the disaster or its long-term implications for public ATS, health and environmental recovery. The evacuation zones surrounding the damaged nuclear plant created post-apocalyptic landscapes that seemed drawn from science fiction films, while the ongoing debates about radiation exposure limits and food safety echoed the concerns that had motivated the original Atomic Monster's creation. Director Hideaki Anno's decision to accept the challenge of creating a new Japanese Godzilla film during this period represented both personal artistic opportunity and cultural responsibility. As the filmmaker whose previous works had explored themes of depression, social isolation, and psychological trauma, was uniquely positioned to address the national anxieties that had emerged from the triple disaster of earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown. Anno's background in animation and his experience with complex narrative structures provided him with tools for approaching the atomic monster from perspectives that had not been explored in previous live-action films. The development of Shin Godzilla as a direct response to contemporary Japanese political and social conditions reflected Anno's understanding that monster movies could serve as vehicles for cultural criticism when they addressed specific institutional failures rather than abstract threats. While his collaboration with special effects director Shinji Higuchi ensured that the film would maintain high production values while pursuing innovative approaches to creature design and urban destruction that would distinguish it from both Japanese and American predecessors. The decision to completely redesign Godzilla's appearance and behavior patterns for Shin Godzilla represented both creative freedom and cultural necessity, as Anno sought to create a monster that would embody contemporary fears about nuclear contamination and government incompetence, rather than simply updating previous designs for modern audiences who might lack direct connection to the Boden historical events that had inspired earlier interpretations of the character. The evolutionary forms that Godzilla assumed throughout the film provided opportunities for body horror that had been largely absent from previous entries in the franchise. While suggesting that nuclear contamination could produce biological changes that transcended normal categories of species development and genetic stability, the creature's initial aquatic form and gradual adaptation to terrestrial existence created narrative tension while providing visual metaphors for contamination spreading from marine environments into populated areas. The government meetings that consumed much of the film's running time provided detailed satire of bureaucratic responses to crisis situations, as officials more concerned with proper procedures and jurisdictional authority than effective action demonstrated the institutional paralysis that had characterized actual government responses to the Fukushima disaster. The endless conferences and committee formations that delayed meaningful response to the monster threat provided pointed criticism of political systems that prioritized process over results when confronted with unprecedented emergencies. The atomic breath sequence that destroyed much of Tokyo was filmed and edited to emphasize the precision and systematic nature of the destruction rather than its random chaos, as Godzilla's methodical elimination of government buildings and military installations suggested both intelligence and purpose that elevated the creature above simple natural disaster toward more complex symbolism about societal judgment and institutional accountability. The purple energy beam that carved through urban landscapes created spectacular visual effects while maintaining connection to nuclear themes through its obvious atomic origins. The international response to the Godzilla threat provided opportunities for commentary about Japan's relationship with foreign powers and the extent to which national sovereignty remained limited by alliance obligations and economic dependencies that constrained domestic policy options during crisis situations. The American military's proposal to use nuclear weapons against the monster within Japanese territory created diplomatic tensions that paralleled real-world debates about base agreements and defense cooperation that had shaped post-war Japanese politics. The scientific solution that ultimately neutralized the monster through blood coagulant rather than military force provided resolution that emphasized intellectual achievement over violent confrontation. While the temporary nature of the victory suggested that the underlying problems represented by Godzilla's existence remained unresolved and would require ongoing vigilance and policy changes to prevent future manifestations of similar threats to national security and public health. The critical acclaim that greeted Shin Godzilla in Japan reflected both appreciation for Anno's innovative approach to familiar material and recognition that the film had succeeded in addressing contemporary social and political concerns through monster movie frameworks that made complex issues accessible to general audiences while maintaining the spectacular entertainment values that such productions required for commercial viability. The international festival circuit success that the film achieved demonstrated that serious approaches to genre material could transcend cultural boundaries when they addressed universal themes about government accountability and place UC's Bellotta, institutional responses to crisis situations. While the limited American theatrical release provided Western audiences with their first opportunity since the original Gojira to experience Japanese Godzilla cinema that prioritized thematic depth over simple action spectacle. The awards recognition that culminated in Shin Godzilla's unprecedented success at the Japan Academy Awards, where it captured multiple major categories including Best Picture, established new precedents for the critical acceptance of genre films, while demonstrating that monster movies could achieve artistic respectability when they were created by filmmakers who understood both the commercial requirements and bar-stove filmmakers. Viscera, cultural possibilities inherent in popular entertainment formats. The parallel success of both American and Japanese Godzilla films during the 2010s demonstrated that the character's symbolic significance remained relevant across different cultural contexts when filmmakers approached the material with appropriate seriousness and understanding of the atomic themes that had originally given the monster its power to embody societal fears about technology's capacity for creating unintended consequences that threatened human survival and environmental stability. In the deep places of atomic memory, where the shadows of Fukushima mingled with the echoes of Hiroshima and the dreams of peaceful nuclear energy transformed into nightmares of technological systems failing when confronted with natural forces beyond human prediction or control. The return of Godzilla to serious cinema represented both cultural necessity and artistic opportunity, as contemporary filmmakers discovered that the atomic monster remained as relevant and powerful a symbol as it had been during the darkest days of the Cold War, when nuclear anxiety had dominated global consciousness and monster movies had provided safe frameworks for confronting fears that might otherwise have proven too overwhelming for direct examination. In the years that followed the dual renaissance of atomic cinema that had seen both American and Japanese filmmakers rediscover the cultural power inherent in serious monster movie storytelling, the commercial success of legendary pictures Godzilla had created institutional momentum for expanding the kaiju concept beyond single-film narratives toward the interconnected universe model that had proven so profitable for superhero properties. Yet, the challenges of translating this approach to giant monster cinema would require creative innovations that pushed the boundaries of what blockbuster entertainment could achieve while maintaining thematic coherence across multiple productions featuring creatures whose very existence challenged conventional narrative structures. The decision to revive King Kong as the cornerstone of this expanding monsterverse reflected both practical considerations about available properties and deeper understanding of the mythological relationships that had connected these iconic monsters since their first cinematic encounter in 1962, when Toho's international co-production had demonstrated that kaiju battles could transcend cultural boundaries while providing spectacular entertainment that satisfied audiences seeking both action and symbolic resonance that elevated such productions above simple creature feature conventions. Director Jordan Vogt Roberts brought to Kong Skull Island a background in independent filmmaking that emphasized character development and visual storytelling over generic action sequences. While his stated intention to create a Vietnam War allegory using giant monster frameworks demonstrated the continued viability of approaching kaiju cinema as a vehicle for social commentary rather than pure escapist spectacle divorced from contemporary political and cultural concerns that shaped audience expectations for meaningful entertainment. The 1970s setting that positioned the film during the height of American military involvement in Southeast Asia provided opportunities for examining themes of imperial overreach and environmental destruction through monster movie metaphors that could make complex political issues accessible to general audiences while maintaining the spectacular production values that contemporary blockbuster cinema required for commercial viability in increasingly competitive global markets dominated by franchise properties and established intellectual properties. The Monarch organization that served as the primary vehicle for connecting Kong's story to the broader monsterverse mythology was presented as a secret government agency whose decades-long mission to study and monitor giant passid former creatures reflected contemporary anxieties about institutional secrecy and the extent to which official organizations concealed information about threats that might affect civilian populations. While their military scientific approach to kaiju research provided frameworks for exploring relationships between knowledge and power that had characterized atomic age anxieties since the Manhattan Project. The diverse ecosystem of creatures that populated Skull Island demonstrated the creative possibilities inherent in expanding kaiju cinema beyond single monster narratives toward more complex ecological frameworks that could support ongoing series development while maintaining the sense of wonder and terror that had distinguished the most successful entries in the monster movie genre throughout its history. The skull crawlers that served as the island's primary threat provided worthy opponents for Kong while embodying themes about invasive species and environmental balance that resonated with contemporary concerns about ecological destruction. The indigenous iwi population that had developed sustainable relationships with the island's giant creatures over centuries provided moral complexity that elevated the story above simple military adventure toward more nuanced examinations of cultural colonialism and the destructive impact of outside intervention upon traditional societies that had achieved equilibrium with their environments through generations of careful adaptation and mutual respect with Taishan, natural forces that Western civilization sought to dominate rather than understand. The helicopter assault sequence that opened the film's action provided spectacular visual effects opportunities while serving as clear metaphor for American military operations in Vietnam. As the advanced technology and overwhelming firepower that the expedition brought to bear against Kong proved inadequate when confronted with an intelligent opponent whose intimate knowledge of local terrain provided tactical advantages that superior equipment could not overcome. The destruction of most aircraft within minutes of the attack demonstrated the futility of applying conventional military doctrine to encounters with forces that operated according to entirely different principles. Colonel Packard's obsessive pursuit of revenge against Kong throughout the remainder of the film provided character-driven conflict that transformed what might have been simple monster movie formula into more complex examination of military psychology and the ways that institutional authority could corrupt individual judgment when personal ego became entangled with professional responsibility. The Colonel's willingness to sacrifice his remaining men for the sake of killing Kong demonstrated how quickly protective instincts could transform into destructive obsessions when filtered through military hierarchies that prioritized mission completion over human welfare. The revelation that Kong was the last survivor of his species provided emotional weight that distinguished him from conventional movie monsters, while establishing mythological foundations for his eventual confrontation with Godzilla. As two ancient titans representing different approaches to coexistence with human civilization would ultimately be forced into conflict by circumstances beyond their control or understanding. The lonely majesty of Kong's position as sole guardian of Skull Island created tragic dimensions that elevated the character above simple action movie antagonist toward more complex symbolism about extinction and survival in rapidly changing environments. The post-credits sequence that revealed Monarch's knowledge of other titans sleeping around the world provided explicit setup for future MonsterVerse entries while demonstrating the scope of the hidden kaiju ecosystem that human civilization had unknowingly shared throughout its development, suggesting that the Atomic Age had not created these creatures but merely awakened forces that had shaped the planet long before humanity had achieved technological capabilities that could threaten global ecological balance. The commercial and critical success of Kong Skull Island validated Legendary's approach to expanding the MonsterVerse through diverse filmmaking styles that could attract different audience demographics while maintaining continuity of mythology and character relationships that would support the eventual convergence of storylines in spectacular team-up productions that could rival the scope and ambition of any contemporary franchise entertainment. The development of Godzilla, King of the Monsters as the direct sequel to Legendary's 2014 film represented both creative opportunity and commercial challenge, as director Michael Dougherty sought to balance fan expectations for spectacular monster battles with thematic depth that could justify the extensive character development and mythological expansion that the story required to establish foundations for even more ambitious future productions within the MonsterVerse framework. The decision to introduce Mothra, Rodan, and King Ghidorah as the primary supporting monsters reflected deep understanding of kaiju mythology and fan expectations, while providing opportunities for spectacular multi-creature battle sequences that would surpass anything previously achieved in American monster cinema, as each classic kaiju received updated designs that maintained their iconic characteristics while incorporating contemporary special effects capabilities that could realize their full potential as cinematic spectacle. The Titan classification system that organized the world's giant creatures into scientific categories provided narrative frameworks for exploring themes about humanity's relationship with natural forces that preceded civilization, while maintaining the sense of awe and terror that had distinguished the most effective monster movies throughout the genre's history. The revelation that these creatures had been worshipped as gods by ancient civilizations provided mythological depth that connected contemporary environmental concerns with humanity's earliest spiritual responses to natural forces. Beyond their comprehension, the environmental themes that drove the film's central conflict positioned the awakened Titans as potential solutions to climate change and ecological collapse, while King Ghidorah's role as an invasive alien species provided clear antagonist whose destruction of natural balance justified both Godzilla's intervention and humanity's eventual alliance with forces they had previously feared. The eco-terrorist organization led by Emma Russell provided human agency within larger conflicts between cosmic forces while addressing contemporary debates about radical environmental action and its moral justifications. The alpha-predator dynamics that determined relationships between different Titan species created opportunities for spectacular dominance displays and territorial conflicts that could support extensive action sequences while maintaining ecological themes about natural hierarchy and environmental balance that distinguished the monsters from simple destructive forces toward more complex roles as guardians and destroyers of planetary systems that supported all life. The sacrifice that concluded Emma Russell's character arc provided emotional resolution that balanced personal redemption with larger themes about individual responsibility for environmental crisis, while demonstrating that meaningful responses to global threats required personal costs that extended beyond simple heroic gestures toward fundamental changes in lifestyle and priorities that contemporary audiences might find challenging, but necessary for addressing real-world environmental challenges. The climactic battle sequence that brought together all four major monsters in spectacular confrontation provided visual spectacle that fulfilled audience expectations while maintaining mythological significance through Mothra's sacrifice to empower Godzilla's final victory over King Ghidorah, demonstrating that cooperation between natural forces could overcome threats that no single entity could defeat independently, while establishing precedents for future conflicts that would require similar alliances between former enemies. The global awakening of additional titans in the film's conclusion created new status quo that positioned kaiju as active participants in planetary ecosystem management rather than dormant threats waiting to be discovered, while establishing narrative foundations for exploring how human civilization might adapt to sharing the Earth with creatures whose power and territorial requirements would necessitate fundamental changes in urban planning, resource extraction, and international relations. The mixed critical reception that greeted the film reflected both appreciation for its spectacular visual effects and criticism of its plot structure, as some reviewers felt that the human storylines distracted from monster action, while others argued that insufficient character development limited emotional investment in the spectacular destruction sequences. The commercial success that the film achieved despite these criticisms demonstrated that audiences remained hungry for kaiju spectacle when it was delivered with appropriate scale and visual imagination. The development of Godzilla vs. Kong as the culmination of the MonsterVerse's first phase reflected both creative ambition and commercial necessity, as the film would need to deliver on promises that had been building since the two monsters were first connected through shared universe mythology, while providing spectacular entertainment that could justify the extensive investment in four-face interconnected storytelling that had characterized the franchise's development strategy. Director Adam Wingard brought to the project a background in horror and action filmmaking that emphasized kinetic energy and visual spectacle over complex character development, reflecting understanding that the film's primary appeal would be the long-awaited rematch between cinema's two most famous giant monsters rather than human storylines that might distract from the epic confrontation that fans had been anticipating since the MonsterVerse's establishment. The Hollow Earth mythology that provided the film's central plot device created opportunities for spectacular underground environments that could serve as appropriate battlegrounds for Titan combat while establishing scientific frameworks for explaining the creatures' origins and territorial relationships that had shaped their interactions throughout geological history. The discovery of ancient civilizations that had coexisted with kaiju provided mythological depth while creating visual spectacle that distinguished the film from previous entries through exploration of environments that no previous monster movie had attempted. The corporate conspiracy that drove the human storyline provided familiar frameworks for criticizing technological hubris while updating classic monster movie themes about scientific overreach for contemporary audiences concerned about artificial intelligence and corporate power that operated beyond democratic oversight or ethical constraints. The creation of Mechagodzilla through combination of King Ghidorah's remains with advanced computer systems provided worthy opposition for both titular monsters, while demonstrating that humanity's attempts to control Titan forces through technological means remained as dangerous as they had been in previous decades. The spectacular battle sequences that dominated the film's final act provided visual spectacle that fulfilled decades of fan expectations, while demonstrating the creative possibilities inherent in modern special effects technology. When applied to monster combat by filmmakers who understood both the technical requirements and mythological significance of such encounters. The Hong Kong setting provided urban environment that could support elaborate destruction while creating neon-lit battlegrounds that enhanced the visual impact of creature combat through dramatic lighting and architectural complexity. The alliance between Godzilla and Kong that resolved their territorial conflict provided emotional satisfaction while establishing mythological precedents for cooperation between alpha predators when confronted with threats that endangered their shared environment, demonstrating that natural enemies could overcome instinctive conflicts when circumstances required unified response to existential dangers that threatened all life rather than simple territorial disputes. The film's commercial success during the challenging theatrical environment created by global pandemic restrictions demonstrated both the enduring appeal of kaiju cinema and the specific attraction of the MonsterVerse approach to monster movie making. While international box office performance confirmed that spectacular creature battles could transcend cultural boundaries when they were produced with appropriate scale and visual imagination that satisfied universal human fascination, with forces beyond ordinary experience. In the deep places of cinematic mythology, where ancient legends merged with contemporary technology and classical monster movie themes adapted to address modern environmental concerns through spectacular entertainment that could reach global audiences hungry for meaning within commercial spectacle, the MonsterVerse had established itself as worthy successor to the traditions established by Ishiro Honda and his collaborators, while demonstrating that American filmmakers could approach kaiju material with appropriate respect for both its cultural origins and its continued relevance to contemporary anxieties about humanity's relationship with natural forces that operated according to principles beyond human control or complete understanding. In the dawn of the 21st century's third decade, when the traditional boundaries between cinematic mediums had begun to dissolve under the pressure of technological innovation and changing audience consumption patterns, the atomic fire that had burned within Godzilla's heart for 7 decades found new vessels for its expression through animated productions that could explore narrative territories and visual possibilities that had remained inaccessible to live-action filmmaking, despite all the advances that computer-generated imagery had achieved in creating believable giant monsters for theatrical exhibition. The decision by Toho and Polygon Pictures to pursue a completely computer-animated Godzilla trilogy represented both creative opportunity and commercial necessity, as the global streaming revolution had created demand for content that could reach international audiences without the distribution challenges that had historically limited Japanese monster movies to domestic markets and specialized genre. Enthusiasts who actively sought out foreign kaiju productions despite language barriers and cultural unfamiliarity with the mythological frameworks that gave such entertainment its deeper significance. The apocalyptic premise that drove Godzilla, Planet of the Monsters, positioned the atomic dinosaur as the ultimate victor in humanity's long struggle with nuclear forces, creating a future timeline where the monster's triumph had forced the remnants of human civilization to abandon Earth entirely in search of new worlds that might prove more hospitable to species that had lost their evolutionary arms. Race with creatures specifically adapted for survival in radioactive environments that technological civilization had inadvertently created through its atomic experimentation. The 20,000-year time span that separated humanity's exile from their eventual return to Earth provided narrative scope that exceeded anything previously attempted in kaiju cinema, allowing the filmmakers to explore themes about environmental recovery, and evolutionary adaptation on geological timescales that dwarfed the immediate concerns that had driven most monster movie plotting throughout the genre's history. The Earth that greeted the returning humans bore little resemblance to the world they had abandoned, as Godzilla's dominance had transformed planetary ecosystems into something utterly alien to species that had evolved during pre-atomic periods. The religious and philosophical themes that emerged from humanity's worship of Godzilla as a divine force during their long exile provided commentary about the ways that traumatic historical events could become mythologized through cultural transmission across generations, while the schism between those who sought to destroy the monster and those who had come to view it as a sacred entity reflected contemporary debates about humanity's proper relationship with natural forces that possessed power beyond technological control or rational comprehension. The Belusaludo and Exif alien species that had accompanied humanity into exile brought their own perspectives and technological capabilities to bear upon the challenge of confronting Godzilla, while their distinct cultural approaches to the monster problem provided opportunities for examining different philosophical frameworks for understanding forces that transcended conventional categories of scientific analysis and military strategy. The tension between technological and spiritual solutions created dramatic conflict that elevated the story above simple action-adventure toward more complex examination of competing worldviews. The massive size that Godzilla had achieved during humanity's absence, growing to exceed 300 meters in height, created visual spectacle that demonstrated both the creative possibilities inherent in animated production and the thematic significance of time and environmental adaptation in shaping the relationships between species competing for planetary dominance. The plant-based ecosystem that had evolved in symbiosis with the atomic monster suggested biological processes that operated according to principles unknown to conventional terrestrial biology. The Mechagodzilla revelation that provided the trilogy's central plot twist transformed what had initially appeared to be a straightforward revenge narrative into more complex examination of cyclical violence and the ways that technological solutions to biological problems could create new categories of threat that exceeded the original challenges they had been designed to address. The city-sized mechanical construct that had been consumed by metallic nanomachines represented the ultimate expression of humanity's attempt to fight atomic monsters through purely technological means. The tragic conclusion that saw most human characters consumed by the very forces they had sought to control provided emotional weight that distinguished the trilogy from more optimistic approaches to similar material, while demonstrating that some conflicts might be fundamentally irresolvable through conventional narrative structures that promised clear victories and satisfying resolutions to complex philosophical and environmental challenges. The international distribution through Netflix that brought the Godzilla anime trilogy to global audiences represented new models for Japanese content reaching international markets without the cultural translation challenges that had historically limited the export potential of domestic monster movies. While the simultaneous worldwide release demonstrated the streaming platform's capacity for bypassing traditional theatrical distribution networks that had often resulted in significant delays or complete absence of foreign base availability for specialized genre productions. The mixed critical reception that greeted the trilogy reflected both appreciation for its ambitious thematic scope and criticism of its pacing and character development, as some viewers found the philosophical discussions and internal monologues that dominated much of the running time less engaging than the spectacular monster battles they had anticipated based on the franchise's live-action traditions. The experimental nature of the project made it a polarizing entry that satisfied some fans while disappointing others who sought more conventional kaiju entertainment. Meanwhile, the development of Godzilla Singular Point as a completely separate animated project demonstrated the creative possibilities that emerged when different production teams approached the same source material from entirely different philosophical and aesthetic perspectives. As the television series pursued themes and visual styles that bore little resemblance to the apocalyptic trilogy, while maintaining connection to the core mythological elements that defined Godzilla's cultural significance across multiple generations of entertainment consumers. The interdimensional horror elements that drove Singular Point's narrative represented the most radical departure from traditional kaiju themes since the original atomic symbolism had been established, as the series presented monsters not as products of nuclear testing or environmental disruption, but as manifestations of mathematical and physical principles that operated according to logic that transcended conventional understanding of natural law and scientific causation. The complex theoretical physics that provided exposition for the monster's existence created intellectual challenges that distinguished the series from more straightforward action-oriented approaches to similar material. The university setting that provided the series' primary human perspective created opportunities for detailed scientific discussion that treated kaiju phenomena as legitimate subjects for academic research rather than simple threats to be eliminated through military action, while the collaboration between researchers from different disciplines provided models for interdisciplinary cooperation that reflected contemporary approaches to complex global challenges requiring expertise from multiple fields of study, simultaneously applied to problems that no single academic specialization could adequately address. The retro-futuristic aesthetic that characterized the series' visual design connected contemporary digital animation techniques with classical science fiction imagery from the Atomic Age's golden period, creating nostalgic appeal that honored the franchise's historical roots, while demonstrating that traditional themes could be updated and recontextualized for audiences whose understanding of atomic anxiety had been shaped by different historical experiences than those that had motivated the original Gojira's creation. The academic approach to monster research that dominated much of the series' character interaction provided commentary about the relationship between theoretical knowledge and practical application, as university researchers found their scientific understanding of kaiju phenomena challenged by encounters with creatures whose behavior patterns defied predictions based on conventional biological or physical models that had been basically developed through study of ordinary terrestrial life forms operating according to familiar natural laws. The musical score that incorporated both classical orchestral elements and contemporary electronic music created sonic landscapes that enhanced the series' themes about the intersection of traditional knowledge and modern technology, while the opening and closing theme songs provided emotional anchors that connected individual episodes to larger narrative arcs spanning the entire season's development of increasingly complex theoretical frameworks for understanding interdimensional monster phenomena. The international streaming distribution that made Singular Point available to global audiences simultaneously with its Japanese broadcast represented continuing evolution in the delivery systems that connected Japanese content creators with worldwide fan communities. While the series' focus on scientific rather than military responses to kaiju threats provided alternative approaches to monster movie formulas that had been dominated by action and spectacle since the genre's earliest development during the Atomic Age's most anxious periods. The video game appearances that had maintained Godzilla's presence in interactive entertainment throughout the decades between major film releases demonstrated the character's multimedia appeal, while providing opportunities for exploring different aspects of the monster's mythology through gameplay mechanics that emphasized either destruction or protection depending upon the specific design philosophies that guided individual productions and their target audience demographics. The fighting game entries that had periodically brought Godzilla into competitive gaming contexts alongside other kaiju characters provided fan service while demonstrating the character's iconic status within popular culture, as recognition of the atomic monster's distinctive silhouette and signature abilities made it suitable for inclusion in games that required immediately identifiable characters whose appeal extended beyond specialized genre. Enthusiasts to encompass broader gaming audiences seeking familiar entertainment properties. The city-building and strategy games that had occasionally featured Godzilla as either destructive force or protective guardian provided different perspectives on the monster's role within human civilization, allowing players to experience both the challenges of defending against kaiju attacks and the potential benefits of cooperation with creatures whose power could be harnessed for constructive rather than purely destructive purposes when appropriate diplomatic or scientific approaches were successfully implemented. The mobile gaming applications that had brought simplified Godzilla experiences to smartphone users worldwide demonstrated the character's continued commercial viability across different technological platforms and audience demographics, while providing revenue streams that could support continued development of more elaborate productions requiring substantial financial investment in special effects and international marketing campaigns. The merchandising empire that surrounded Godzilla's various media appearances encompassed everything from detailed collector figures that appealed to adult fans to simple toys designed for children who were encountering the character for the first time, while clothing and household items featuring the monster's imagery demonstrated its penetration into mainstream consumer culture beyond specialized genre markets that had historically defined the boundaries of kaiju commercial appeal. The international fan communities that had emerged around different interpretations of Godzilla provided cultural bridges that connected enthusiasts across national and linguistic boundaries, while online forums and social media groups created spaces for detailed discussion of the character's symbolic significance and artistic evolution throughout its 7 decades of continuous development across multiple media formats and creative approaches. The influence that Godzilla had exerted upon other monster movie productions throughout the world could be traced through design elements and thematic approaches that had been adapted and reinterpreted by filmmakers seeking to create their own versions of atomic age anxiety using creatures that bore clear resemblance to the Japanese original, while reflecting different cultural perspectives on nuclear technology and environmental destruction. The academic attention that had increasingly focused upon Godzilla as a subject worthy of serious cultural analysis demonstrated the character's elevation from simple entertainment property to legitimate topic for scholarly investigation. As film studies, programs, and cultural criticism courses began incorporating monster movies into curricula that examined the ways that popular entertainment could serve as vehicle for processing collective trauma and social anxiety through fantastic frameworks that made difficult topics accessible to general audiences. The environmental activism that had adopted Godzilla as an unofficial mascot for campaigns addressing climate change and nuclear waste disposal reflected the character's continued relevance to contemporary political debates, while demonstrating that fictional monsters could serve as powerful symbols for mobilizing public opinion around issues that might otherwise remain too abstract or technically complex for effective grassroots organizing efforts. The museum exhibitions that had featured Godzilla alongside other cultural artifacts from the atomic age provided institutional recognition of the character's historical significance, while retrospective film festivals and academic conferences devoted to kaiju cinema demonstrated growing appreciation for monster movies as legitimate subjects for serious critical analysis rather than mere curiosities worthy only of nostalgic affection or dismissive ridicule from cultural gatekeepers. In the deep places of digital memory, where pixels had replaced celluloid and streaming algorithms determined which stories reached global audiences hungry for content that could provide both entertainment and meaning within increasingly fragmented media landscapes. The atomic fire that had first burned in Godzilla's heart continued to illuminate new pathways for artistic expression and cultural commentary that transcended the limitations of any single medium or national tradition, demonstrating that truly powerful symbols could adapt and evolve while maintaining their essential significance for audiences seeking frameworks for understanding forces that operated beyond conventional human experience or rational control. In the years that followed the spectacular convergence of monsters and mythology that had marked the MonsterVerse's establishment as a global entertainment phenomenon, when the ancient titans had claimed their place within contemporary popular culture while simultaneously serving as vessels for humanity's ongoing anxieties about environmental destruction and technological hubris, the King of Monsters found himself standing at yet another crossroads of cultural significance as new generations of filmmakers sought to balance reverence for 7 decades of cinematic tradition with the urgent need to address contemporary concerns that had evolved far beyond the atomic fears that had originally given birth to the most enduring creature in genre cinema history. The triumph of Godzilla -1 in 2023 represented perhaps the most unexpected vindication of the monster's continued cultural relevance, as director Takashi Yamazaki's return to the character's post-war Japanese origins created a film that managed to honor the thematic depth of Honda's original masterpiece while incorporating modern production techniques that could compete with contemporary blockbuster cinema on purely technical grounds, demonstrating that serious approaches to kaiju storytelling retain their power to move audiences when they were executed with appropriate skill and genuine understanding of the historical and cultural forces that had shaped the CEAC monster's symbolic significance. The decision to set the film in the immediate aftermath of World War II, positioning Godzilla's emergence during Japan's most vulnerable historical moment when the nation struggled to rebuild both its physical infrastructure and its collective identity following defeat and occupation, provided thematic frameworks that connected contemporary anxieties about political leadership and social responsibility with the historical trauma that had originally inspired the atomic monster's creation, while creating opportunities for character development and emotional resonance that elevated the story above simple creature feature conventions. The practical effects work that dominated Yamazaki's approach to depicting Godzilla demonstrated that traditional Japanese special effects techniques remained viable alternatives to the computer-generated imagery that had come to dominate international monster movie production, while the integration of digital enhancement with physical models and pyrotechnics created visual spectacle that honored the craftsmanship traditions established by Eiji Tsuburaya while achieving levels of detail and realism that exceeded anything previously accomplished through purely practical methods. The focus upon individual human stories within the larger framework of national crisis provided emotional anchors that prevented the spectacular destruction sequences from becoming empty spectacle divorced from genuine stakes or meaningful consequences. As each character's personal struggle with wartime trauma and post-conflict recovery reflected broader themes about collective healing and the psychological costs that entire societies paid when they were forced to confront the consequences of decisions made by leaders whose priorities had placed national ambition above citizen welfare. The critical acclaim that greeted Godzilla -1 throughout international film festivals and award ceremonies demonstrated that serious approaches to genre material could achieve mainstream recognition when they addressed universal themes about courage, sacrifice, and community responsibility through narratives that respected both their fantastic elements and their underlying human concerns. While the film's eventual Academy Award recognition marked the first time that a Godzilla production had received such prestigious validation of its artistic achievements, the commercial success that the film achieved despite its relatively modest budget and limited initial distribution proved that audiences around the world retained their appetite for monster movies that treated their subject matter with a higher appropriate gravity while providing spectacular entertainment that could satisfy contemporary expectations for visual effects and production values, demonstrating that the kaiju genre's commercial viability did not depend upon massive Hollywood production budgets when filmmakers possessed sufficient creativity and technical skill to maximize their available resources. Meanwhile, the ongoing development of future MonsterVerse entries continued to explore different approaches to updating classical monster mythology for contemporary audiences. As Legendary Pictures sought to balance fan expectations for spectacular creature battles with thematic exploration of environmental and social issues that could provide meaningful frameworks for addressing current global challenges. Through the safe emotional distance that fantastic entertainment could provide for audiences seeking both escape and enlightenment within their commercial entertainment choices. The Apple TV series that would eventually bring Godzilla to premium streaming television represented another evolutionary step in the character's multimedia expansion, as episodic storytelling formats could provide opportunities for character development and mythological exploration that theatrical films might lack sufficient running time to accommodate, while the international distribution capabilities of streaming platforms could ensure that Japanese cultural perspectives on the monster's significance reached global audiences without the cultural translation challenges that have historically limited such content to specialized genre markets. The video game developments that continued to feature Godzilla across multiple gaming platforms demonstrated the character's versatility as interactive entertainment, while virtual reality applications began exploring possibilities for immersive experiences that could allow participants to encounter the atomic monster at full scale in ways that traditional media formats could never provide, creating new categories of entertainment that blurred boundaries between passive consumption and active participation in kaiju mythology. The environmental activism that increasingly adopted Godzilla as a symbol for campaigns addressing climate change and nuclear waste disposal reflected the character's continued relevance to contemporary political debates, while demonstrating that fictional monsters could serve powerful symbolic functions for mobilizing public opinion around issues that might otherwise remain too abstract or technically complex for effective grassroots organizing efforts. That required emotional engagement alongside intellectual understanding. The academic recognition that had elevated Godzilla studies to legitimate scholarly discipline within film programs and cultural criticism courses provided institutional validation of the monster's significance as a subject worthy of serious intellectual investigation. While research into the character's symbolic evolution across 7 decades of continuous development created new frameworks for understanding how popular entertainment could serve as a vehicle for processing collective trauma and processing social anxiety through fantastic premises that made difficult topics accessible to general audiences. The international fan communities that had emerged around different interpretations of Godzilla continued to provide cultural bridges that connected enthusiasts across national and linguistic boundaries. While online forums and social media groups created spaces for detailed discussion of the character's artistic development and symbolic significance that demonstrated the depth of emotional investment that multiple generations of Baichensiv viewers had developed in the atomic monster's ongoing cultural presence and mythological evolution. The museum exhibitions that regularly featured Godzilla alongside other cultural artifacts from the atomic age provided institutional recognition of the character's historical importance, while retrospective film festivals and academic conferences devoted to kaiju cinema demonstrated growing appreciation for monster movies as legitimate subjects for serious critical analysis rather than mere curiosities worthy only of nostalgic affection or dismissive ridicule from cultural gatekeepers who failed to recognize the sophisticated social commentary that the best entries in the genre had consistently provided. The influence that Godzilla continued to exert upon international monster movie productions could be traced through design elements and thematic approaches that appeared in films from around the world. As directors and special effects artists drew inspiration from 7 decades of Japanese kaiju cinema, while adapting its innovations to address their own cultural concerns and artistic objectives, demonstrating the universal appeal of stories that use giant creatures to explore humanity's complex relationship with forces beyond their control or complete understanding. The merchandising opportunities that surrounded each new Godzilla production encompassed everything from detailed collector figures that appealed to adult fans to educational materials designed for children who were encountering the fouled character for the first time, while licensing agreements ensured that the monster's imagery appeared on products ranging from clothing and household items to automotive accessories and architectural elements that brought kaiju aesthetics into everyday environments where they could serve as constant reminders of the atomic age's continuing influence upon contemporary culture. The technological innovations that each new production brought to monster movie filmmaking created precedents that influenced not only subsequent kaiju cinema, but the broader field of special effects work. As techniques developed for depicting giant creatures proved applicable to other categories of fantastic entertainment that required convincing integration of practical and digital elements to achieve believable representations of impossible phenomena, demonstrating that genre filmmaking could serve as an incubator for technical advances that eventually benefited the entire entertainment industry. The translation challenges that continued to affect international distribution of Japanese Godzilla films reflected ongoing cultural barriers that prevented full appreciation of the character's symbolic significance among audiences who lacked historical context for understanding the atomic themes that had originally motivated the monster's creation. While subtitling and dubbing decisions often eliminated nuances of meaning that were essential to comprehending the deeper philosophical and political commentary that distinguished the best kaiju films from simple action entertainment. The generational differences in audience response to different interpretations of Godzilla created ongoing debates about the character's essential characteristics and proper role within contemporary entertainment. As older fans who had grown up with specific versions of the monster sometimes found themselves at odds with newer interpretations that reflected different cultural priorities and filmmaking technologies, demonstrating that long-running franchises inevitably face challenges in balancing tradition with innovation across multiple decades of continuous development. The global climate crisis that had emerged as humanity's most pressing environmental challenge provided new context for understanding Godzilla's symbolic significance as a representative of natural forces that operated beyond human control. While the monster's traditional role as both destroyer and protector offered mythological frameworks for exploring different approaches to environmental stewardship and the consequences of treating the natural world as a resource to be exploited rather than a system to be respected and preserved for future generations. The ongoing nuclear threats that persisted despite the end of the Cold War continued to provide relevance for the atomic themes that had originally inspired Godzilla's creation, while contemporary concerns about nuclear terrorism, reactor safety, and radioactive waste disposal ensured that the monster's symbolic function as an embodiment of atomic anxiety remained meaningful for audiences who faced their own versions of nuclear fear, even if the specific geopolitical contexts had evolved beyond the superpower rivalries that had defined earlier periods of international tension. In the deep places of cultural memory, where the shadows of atomic fire still danced with the dreams of peaceful coexistence and the ancient rhythms of geological time continued to pulse beneath the urgent concerns of daily human existence, Godzilla remained as both monument and warning, as symbol of humanity's capacity for both creation and destruction, standing eternal watch over a species that had learned to split atoms and resurrect legends. but had not yet mastered the wisdom necessary to guide such powers toward purposes that served life rather than death, hope rather than despair, future generations rather than immediate gratification that could not sustain itself across the vast timescales that atomic consequences demanded for their complete resolution and ultimate transcendence. And so we reach the twilight of our journey through the atomic age of cinema, where we have witnessed the birth of legends from the ashes of tragedy and watched as humanity's greatest fears transformed into its most beloved protector. From the devastated shores of post-war Japan to the digital landscapes of modern blockbusters, Godzilla has remained a constant companion to our species, reflecting our anxieties while offering the hope that even our greatest mistakes might find redemption through time and understanding. In the deep places of memory, where the echoes of air raid sirens blend with triumphant monster roars, and the mushroom clouds of destruction give way to the northern lights of possibility, the King of Monsters stands eternal, not as conqueror, but as guardian, not as destroyer, but as reminder that from humanity's darkest hours can emerge its most enduring symbols of resilience and wonder. Rest now, fellow witness to these atomic dreams, knowing that somewhere in the vast Pacific of imagination, Godzilla slumbers beneath the waves, waiting for the next generation to need reminding that even monsters can teach us how to be more human. Let the gentle rhythm of distant surf carry you to sleep, while atomic fire burns softly in the hearth of cultural memory, keeping watch over all who dare to dream of giants.